Hello, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we're bringing you a selection of eerie stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Before diving into the atmosphere of suspense, leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear gradually envelop you, and tell us what kind of stories you'd like to hear next time. Settle in, we're about to begin. Have you ever wondered about the past, about things that have happened before you were even born? There are stories, old ones, buried in the deepest corners of time that can find their way to you. Some people would say that history is set in stone, but what if it's not? What if the past is still talking to you? I didn't expect to find anything that night. It was late, and I was sorting through a box of old things I'd inherited from my late uncle. He had been a collector, one of those people who found meaning in things others discarded. Old radios, dusty books, and boxes of cassettes that probably hadn't been touched in years. I didn't know much about him. His life had always seemed a mystery to me, just like the things he left behind. One of those tapes caught my attention. It wasn't labeled, just an old cassette that seemed out of place among the others. There was something about it that felt wrong. I don't know how to explain it. Maybe it was just the weight of it, how it seemed heavier than it should be, as though it carried something more than just sound. I slipped it into an old tape recorder I found in the box, its buttons worn and faded from years of use. As soon as I pressed play, a crackling noise filled the room, followed by a deep, almost familiar voice. The words weren't clear at first, but gradually, the static faded and I could make them out. Listen carefully, the voice began. What you're hearing is the key. You must understand. Everything is connected. I froze, my hand still on the recorder. It felt personal, like the voice was speaking directly to me. But how? I hadn't even known about this tape until now. It was as if someone, somehow, had known I would be the one to find it. Tomorrow, you'll feel it. The first warning, the first sign. Don't ignore it, the voice continued, its tone urgent now. Something is coming. Something you can't outrun. I sat there, motionless, as the voice went on, giving strange, cryptic details that I couldn't fully comprehend. It described events in my life that hadn't happened yet, things I didn't even know were possible. The voice seemed to know about things I hadn't told anyone. The faintest whispers of my thoughts, as if it had been following me all along. The more I listened, the more the voice's tone grew desperate. Do not ignore the signs, it repeated over and over. You'll be too late if you wait. The room around me seemed to grow colder. The familiar sounds of the house, the creaks of the floorboards, the soft hum of the refrigerator suddenly felt distant, almost hollow. There was a weight in the air, thick and suffocating, as if the very atmosphere had changed. When the tape finally stopped, I sat there in stunned silence. I felt unsettled, like I had just opened a door that should have remained shut. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that the warning the voice gave was not just some random words, but a call for something that would soon happen. I didn't want to believe it. It seemed ridiculous. The voice on the tape was just a recording, right? There was no way it could be true. But as I sat there, staring at the recorder, I couldn't help but feel that it had been meant for me. I couldn't explain it, but something deep inside told me that I had no choice but to listen. Tomorrow. The voice said tomorrow. And I had a sinking feeling that I wouldn't be able to ignore whatever it was. The sounds of the house continued as if nothing had happened. But in the back of my mind, that voice echoed, growing louder, more insistent. I had no idea then that the voice would be the beginning of something that would change everything I knew about reality and my place in it. But that was only the start. The next day, I woke up feeling off. It wasn't a feeling I could place, just a sense of something being wrong, like the world wasn't quite where it should be. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was the tape from last night, still playing in my head. But I couldn't ignore the unease that clung to me. I went through my usual morning routine, trying to push the thoughts away. The voice. It had to be a coincidence, right? But I couldn't stop thinking about the warning. Tomorrow, you'll feel it. The first warning. The words had haunted me all night. At work, everything felt strange. People moved around me, but their voices seemed muffled, as if I were underwater. I tried to focus on my tasks, but my mind kept drifting back to the tape. And then, just as the voice had said, I felt it, the first sign. It started as a low hum, almost imperceptible. At first, I thought it was just the hum of the office lights, but then it grew louder, vibrating through the walls. My coworkers didn't seem to notice. They went on talking, typing, moving as if nothing was unusual. But the hum was growing, vibrating in my chest, like the walls themselves were alive. I could feel it in my bones. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. It was like a weight pressing down on me, pulling my attention towards something just out of reach. Then, the lights flickered. I didn't know what to make of it. It was a power glitch, probably. But the air felt heavy, and that hum, it was no longer just in my chest. It was everywhere. Around me. Above me. Beneath me. I excused myself and stepped into the hallway, trying to escape the strange sensation. The hum seemed to stop the moment I stepped out of the room and the normal sounds of the office returned. But the weight in my chest didn't go away. Something wasn't right. That evening, when I returned home, I had to check the tape again. I needed to hear the voice to understand what was happening. I sat in the same chair I had been in the night before and pressed play. The crackling sound filled the room, followed by the voice, exactly as I remembered it. You felt it, didn't you? It asked, its tone somehow different this time. More knowing. The hum, the disturbance. That is just the beginning. You're in danger. The words hit me like a cold wave. I hadn't said anything to anyone about what had happened at work. How could the voice know? I swallowed hard, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. The voice continued, now more insistent. You have to act quickly. It's already too late to stop what's coming, but you can still save yourself. The room seemed to grow colder again. The shadows deepened, stretching unnaturally. I glanced around, suddenly aware of the silence that had filled the space. The normal creaks of the house, the hum of the refrigerator, everything was muted. It was as if the world outside the room had stopped. Listen, the voice said, its urgency rising. You're not alone in this. Someone is coming for you. And they're already closer than you think. I stood up abruptly, the tape still playing in my hands. My pulse was racing. I had to get out. I had to go somewhere. But where? And who was coming for me? The room felt smaller now, like the walls were closing in, pressing on me. I felt dizzy, lightheaded. My vision blurred for a moment, and when it cleared, the shadows seemed deeper, darker. Almost alive. I dropped the tape recorder, the sound still playing in the background. I ran to the window and threw it open, gasping for air, trying to shake the feeling that had settled into my skin. Nothing outside seemed different, but everything inside me was telling me something was wrong. The voice on the tape had warned me about something I couldn't even comprehend. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I couldn't ignore it. The warning was clear: you can't outrun this. But was it too late? Could I stop whatever was coming? Or had the voice already led me into something I was powerless to avoid? As I stared out the window into the growing darkness, I knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The voice had set something in motion, and I was just beginning to understand what that meant. I barely slept that night. The voice kept echoing in my head like a broken record. I couldn't escape it. It was always there, whispering its warnings, each one more insistent than the last. You can't outrun this, it repeated over and over. Someone is coming for you. I thought about the tape all night. The second morning was clear. It wasn't just a random voice. It was someone trying to reach me. But who? And why? The next morning, I woke up exhausted, drained from the restless night. The weight in my chest hadn't lifted. In fact, it felt heavier. Like I was carrying something invisible, but I couldn't shake it off. I went to work, mechanically going through the motions, but every sound seemed to send me into a state of heightened awareness. The hum from yesterday was still with me, echoing in the back of my mind. It didn't matter that I was surrounded by people, busy with their own tasks. I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. And then, at lunch, it happened again. The hum. It started low, barely noticeable, but it quickly grew, just like before. The lights flickered, and the air in the room grew thick with tension. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't just the hum this time. There was something else, a voice, faint but unmistakable. It was a whisper, too soft to make out the words, but I could feel its presence. It was real, and it was speaking to me. I stood up, feeling a cold sweat break out across my skin. I had to get out of there. I couldn't stay in that office with that voice crawling into my thoughts. I grabbed my things and hurried to the exit, ignoring the concerned looks from my coworkers. The hallway was quieter than usual, almost unnervingly so. As I walked down it, the walls seemed to close in on me, the shadows stretching as though they were alive. Then, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. I froze. It wasn't the usual creaks of the building. These were deliberate steps, slow, methodical, getting closer. The hallway was empty. There was no one behind me. The footsteps should have been impossible, but I could hear them as clear as day. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing there. Just the empty hallway. Still, the footsteps continued. Closer, closer. My breath caught in my throat as I broke into a run, not daring to look behind me. The door to the stairwell was just ahead. I pushed it open, rushing down the stairs, my mind racing. The footsteps followed, always just behind me, never stopping, never fading. I burst into the street and stumbled to a halt, panting for breath. The air outside was cold, but it didn't matter. I needed to get away. Away from the office. Away from the building. Away from the voice. I stumbled into the nearest cafe, my pulse still racing, hands shaking as I clutched my coat around me. I tried to steady my breathing, tried to calm the panic that was rising in my chest, but the footsteps, those steps, were still with me. I could hear them, clear as day, in the back of my mind, echoing. The voice. The warning. "You're not alone," it said again, this time louder. "They're getting closer." I tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the warmth of the cafe around me, the soft chatter of people at the tables. But it was impossible. The sound, the feeling of being followed, it wouldn't stop. And then, something shifted in the room. I looked up, and there, across the cafe, standing by the door, was a man. He wasn't facing me, but I could feel his eyes on me, even from the distance. His presence was unmistakable. I don't know why, but I knew. I knew he was the one the voice had been warning me about. The man in the cafe, he was the one who had been following me. And I had no idea how he had gotten here, but I was certain he wasn't supposed to be. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. I couldn't breathe. The man didn't move, but I could feel him closing in, like a shadow creeping over me. The voice echoed again, this time frantic. "You're running out of time. He's here. He's already here." I bolted to my feet, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. My heart was racing, my mind a blur of panic. The man didn't move, he just stood there, watching me with that unnerving stillness. But I couldn't stay. I had to go. I rushed for the door, ignoring the puzzled looks from the other patrons. My pulse pounded in my ears, my vision narrowing as I stepped outside into the cold, and once again I could hear the footsteps behind me. Always behind me. As I walked down the street, the world around me felt unreal, like I was walking through a dream. Or a nightmare. The man in the cafe had been real, but the warning, the voice, everything felt connected. I didn't know what to do anymore. I had to face whatever was coming. The voice had led me this far, but I didn't know what it wanted from me. And deep down, I wondered if it was too late to stop it. It was late when I finally returned home. The apartment felt empty, colder than usual, like the walls themselves were closing in on me. I tried to shake off the feeling of dread that had been gnawing at me all day, but it clung to me, a heavy weight that wouldn't lift. I had barely entered my apartment when I heard it again, the soft hum. It wasn't as loud as before, but it was there, in the background, just beneath the surface of everything. I went straight to the kitchen, needing to focus on something, anything, besides the voice that had been haunting me. But then, it stopped. The hum faded. And in its place, I heard the footsteps again. Clearer this time. My heart raced. The footsteps weren't coming from the hallway. They weren't even coming from the floor beneath me. They were coming from inside the apartment. I stood frozen, my breath shallow, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But it wasn't. I could hear them, slow, deliberate steps, coming closer. I turned toward the sound, eyes scanning the dimly lit apartment, but there was nothing. The apartment was empty. My pulse quickened as I moved cautiously down the hallway, my footsteps echoing too loudly in the silence. The bathroom door was ajar, and I froze when I saw it, something dark, shifting in the corner. A shadow, not cast by the light, but moving on its own. Something was there, something that didn't belong. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The air around me grew thick, and the voice, came again, this time louder and more urgent. "You're not alone." It was more than just a warning now. It felt like a command, like something I had no choice but to obey. I reached out for the light switch, but before I could flip it, I heard a voice, someone else, but not from the recording. This voice was real, coming from the corner of the room. Leave. Now. I spun around, my heart racing. I saw nothing, only shadows. But the voice, it wasn't a whisper anymore. It was clear, sharp, and commanding. Leave. While you can. I wanted to scream, to run, to get out of there before whatever was haunting me could reach me. But I couldn't move. My legs were frozen in place, my body rigid with terror. The footsteps, the voice, it all made sense now. It wasn't just a warning. It was real. And whatever had been following me was here. I backed away slowly, the feeling of being watched crawling over my skin. Every instinct told me to run, but I couldn't bring myself to turn my back on whatever was in that room. The air was suffocating, thick with an oppressive presence I couldn't escape. Then, I heard it. A low, guttural sound. It was coming from the dark corner where the shadow had been. I couldn't tell what it was, but it was alive. And it was moving. Without thinking, I bolted. I didn't care about the darkness, or the voice, or the danger that might be waiting for me outside. I just needed to get out. I didn't even know where I was going, only that I had to leave before it was too late. I ran down the stairs, through the hallways of my apartment building, and out the door into the cold night. The city was silent, the only sound the echo of my footsteps on the pavement. The air was sharp with the chill of early autumn, but I didn't feel the cold. I felt nothing but the frantic pounding of my heart, the weight of dread pressing down on me. And then I heard it again. The footsteps. But they weren't behind me this time. They were in front of me. I stopped dead in my tracks, my eyes scanning the empty street, but I saw nothing. No one. There was no one there. Yet the footsteps were still there, closer now, closer than they had ever been. I felt my breath catch in my throat, the terror rising inside me. The voice came again, this time softer, more insistent. You cannot escape it. I turned, looking over my shoulder, but there was no one there. The voice wasn't in my ear, but in my mind. It was everywhere. It was suffocating. In a blind panic, I ran down the street, not knowing where I was going, but unable to stop. I ran until my legs felt like they would give out, until my lungs burned and my body ached. But no matter how fast I ran, the footsteps never stopped. They never faded. I collapsed against a lamppost, panting, my hands trembling. My mind was a mess of fear and confusion, and the voice still echoed in my head, louder now, almost as if it were laughing at me. You can't outrun it. You can't hide from what's coming. And then it came, just as the voice had said. A shadow, tall and looming, appeared at the end of the street. I didn't see its face, but I didn't need to. I knew. I knew what it was. The footsteps stopped. The voice stopped. But the presence was still there. I felt its eyes on me, watching, waiting. And in that moment, I knew one thing for certain. It had found me. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the shadow that had materialized before me. Time felt like it had come to a standstill, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The only thing that was real in that moment was the undeniable sense of dread that hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The shadow didn't move, didn't make a sound, but it was there. I could feel it. Its presence was more than just physical. It was a part of the very fabric of reality, a thing that had existed long before I had stumbled upon it, and would continue to exist long after I was gone. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything to escape it. but I couldn't. My legs refused to move. My body was frozen in place, my mind a whirlwind of panic and confusion. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the voice came again. You shouldn't have listened. I wanted to cry out, to demand answers, to scream at it to stop, but the words caught in my throat. The voice wasn't just speaking, it was inside me now, reverberating through my very thoughts. It was alive in my mind. It's too late now. And suddenly, I understood. The voice, this thing, this presence, had been guiding me all along. It wasn't just a warning. It had been setting things in motion, leading me to this moment. Everything, from the first crackling sound on the tape to the footsteps, to the shadow now standing before me, it had all been a part of its plan. I tried to fight it, to push back, but it was no use. The weight of its power was overwhelming. It was like a fog, crawling through my mind, taking root in my thoughts. You are part of the story now. There is no escaping it. The words sent a chill down my spine, but I couldn't tear myself away. I couldn't look away from the shadow, from the thing that had been lurking in the dark corners of my mind all along. And then, something shifted. The shadow began to move, its form rippling like smoke, stretching and twisting as it advanced toward me. I wanted to run, to escape, but I was rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to speak. The voice was louder now, almost deafening. You were always meant to find me. I've been waiting for you. The words echoed in my head, a twisted, mocking laugh following them. The shadow loomed over me, its dark tendrils reaching out, as if to pull me into its embrace. And in that moment, I realized the truth. This wasn't some random occurrence. It wasn't just a haunted recording or a coincidence. It was intentional. This had been planned. Everything in my life, the quiet hum, the whispers in the dark, the strange feeling of being watched, it had all been a part of the game. A game that had been set in motion long before I had ever pressed play on that tape. I was never meant to escape. The shadow engulfed me, its darkness consuming everything. The world around me faded away, and the voice, now a constant presence in my mind, whispered one final time. You belong to me now. And then, there was nothing. I woke up in my bed, the sunlight streaming through the window. I blinked, disoriented, my mind foggy. For a moment, I wasn't sure if everything had been a dream. But then I saw it, the tape recorder on the desk, the same one I had used to play the mysterious recording. The same one that had started it all. The tape was still inside. I walked over to it slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. Without thinking, I pressed the play button. But this time, there was no crackling noise. No ominous voice. Just silence. Except for one thing. The faint sound of footsteps. And then, the whisper. You can never leave. It was a strange thing to see. I walked along the shore, my boots sinking slightly into the damp sand with each step. The evening air was crisp, the scent of salt and brine thick in my lungs. The sky was heavy with clouds, the sun barely a sliver above the horizon. Yet, despite the dimness, there was the flicker of a light, faint but steady, cutting through the growing darkness. The lighthouse. I had heard the stories. They said it had been abandoned long ago, that a storm had taken it, shattered it into pieces that the sea had swallowed whole. The locals would whisper about it in hushed tones, as if the very mention could summon the spirit of the place. But I hadn't believed them, not until I saw the light. It flickered once more, like a signal, its beam flashing across the water and vanishing behind the rocky outcrop. The waves crashed violently against the jagged cliffs, as if they were trying to tell me something, to warn me. For a moment, I hesitated. It seemed impossible that the lighthouse could still be there, much less working. But the light, it was too real, too constant to ignore. Something about it stirred me, drew me closer. I knew I shouldn't be going. I knew the stories, the warnings, but I couldn't help myself. I took a step forward, then another. My legs moved before I could stop them, pulled toward the light, as if some invisible force was guiding me. The wind picked up, colder now, biting at my skin. The light flashed again, more intensely this time, as if it were calling to me, urging me to come closer. I quickened my pace, the sound of the waves crashing in my ears, the salt water spraying misting over my face. The light was closer now, the beam brighter. It flickered and flashed, as if it was alive. The air around me grew still, a strange silence settling in as the sounds of the ocean seemed to fade away. It was unnerving, the sudden absence of noise. I felt a shiver run down my spine, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. And then I heard it. A soft whisper, barely audible over the sound of the ocean. It was faint at first, like a distant murmur. But it grew clearer, the words forming in my mind before I could even hear them. A voice. Not human, but somehow close. Come closer, it whispered. I froze. The hairs on my arms prickled. My breath caught in my throat. The voice was not coming from any person. It was coming from the lighthouse. The light flickered again, this time longer, more deliberate. And then I saw it, a shadow moving within the beam, a figure, tall and thin, standing in the doorway of the crumbling lighthouse. Come closer. It was no longer a whisper, but a command, firm and unyielding. The sound seemed to vibrate in my chest, reverberating through my bones. I took another step forward. Then another. The air grew colder still, a chill settling into my very bones. The waves crashed louder now, the sound pounding in my ears like a drum. But I couldn't stop. I had to know. What was this place? What was that light? As I moved closer to the base of the lighthouse, the shadows seemed to grow longer, stretching out like dark fingers reaching for me. The figure at the door was still there, unmoving, watching. I was almost there. Just a few more steps, and I would be inside. Safe, perhaps. Or maybe not. But as I reached out for the crumbling doorframe, a thought hit me, one I hadn't considered before. What if I wasn't the one who was walking toward the light? What if the light was walking toward me? And in that moment, I realized something else, something far worse. The light didn't want me to come closer. It wanted me to stay. Forever. The whisper was louder now, not a voice, but a command, so powerful I could feel it in my chest. Stay. But it was too late. I had already taken the final step, and the darkness swallowed me whole. I woke to silence. For a moment, I thought I had dreamed it all, the voice, the light, the figure standing in the doorway. But as my eyes adjusted to the dark, I saw the truth. I wasn't where I had been before. I wasn't on the beach anymore, standing at the foot of the lighthouse. I was inside. The air was damp and thick, like the walls themselves were breathing. I could taste the salt in the air, but it didn't feel the same. It was heavier, almost suffocating. I tried to move, but something held me in place, an invisible weight pressing down on my limbs. I felt disoriented, my body not responding as it should, my muscles stiff and sluggish. The only sound was the soft creak of wood, the floorboards groaning under some unseen pressure. The darkness was absolute, oppressive, but I could still feel it, the presence, that pull. The light had faded, but it hadn't gone out. It still burned somewhere in the distance, just beyond my reach, beckoning. I tried to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. Something was wrong. It was as if the air itself had turned thick, like I was breathing in something that wasn't meant to be breathed. My heart raced, but there was no escape. My eyes darted around, but the blackness around me was like a solid wall. And then I saw it. A faint outline moving through the dark, like a shadow within a shadow. It wasn't a person, or at least, not fully. It was a shape, tall and indistinct, shifting unnaturally. The edges of it seemed to blur, like smoke or fog, but the longer I stared, the more defined it became. A figure. A figure that wasn't standing still anymore. It moved toward me, slow at first, its movement more like gliding than walking. The closer it got, the more details I could make out, the shape of its arms, the long, unnatural length of its limbs. It was no longer a figure, it was a presence, something more than human. And it was drawing closer. I tried to move, but my feet felt like they were stuck in wet concrete. My hands trembled as I reached out for something, anything to steady myself. But the floor was slick, wet, as though it had been exposed to the sea for far too long. The figure stopped just a few feet away from me, its shape now distinct, its presence suffocating. A voice, deeper this time, came from within it. Not a whisper, but a rumbling growl, like thunder echoing from somewhere deep inside the earth. "Why did you come?" I tried to speak, but the words stuck in my throat. I had no answer. I didn't even know why I had walked into the lighthouse. Why had I let that light draw me in? I didn't mean to, I stammered, but the words felt wrong, as though they weren't my own. The figure moved again, closer this time. My body froze, but my mind screamed for me to run, to do anything. But my legs were paralyzed, my limbs betraying me. It reached out, long fingers brushing against my face. The cold was unbearable, like ice crawling beneath my skin. I gasped, but no air came. It was as if my breath had been stolen from me, the life slowly draining away. The figure didn't speak again, but I could feel it. It wasn't just touching me. It was searching me, probing my thoughts, my memories. It knew me in a way that I couldn't understand. I wasn't sure if it was reading my mind or if it was taking something from me. The walls seemed to close in around me, the space growing smaller and smaller, the shadows creeping forward like they had a life of their own. And then, in the distance, the light flickered again. I could feel the pull of it, like it was calling me, urging me to come closer. But I didn't want to. I couldn't go back. Not with it here. I turned toward the door, but the figure stepped in front of me, blocking my path. Its presence was overwhelming now, as if the very air around me was pressing me down. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowed faintly, like dying embers. It watched me, silent and unblinking, as if waiting for something. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The silence was deafening. "Stay," the voice said again, this time more insistent, more powerful. I tried to fight it, tried to turn away, but the words held me in place. The cold, the shadows, the weight of the air, it was too much. I felt myself slipping, my vision blurring, my body growing weaker with every passing second. But then, a thought broke through. The lighthouse was broken. It was abandoned. It shouldn't be here. I couldn't stay. I had to get out. I pushed against the presence, against the overwhelming force that held me. My legs, trembling and unsteady, finally moved. I took a step back, then another. The figure didn't stop me this time. It just watched, unmoving. I reached the door, but as I touched the handle, I felt something cold wrap around my wrist, pulling me back. It was stronger now. Stronger than before. And then the whisper came again, not from the figure, but from everywhere. Stay with me. I couldn't move. The door was within reach, but the light was calling me, pulling me deeper into the darkness. I closed my eyes, holding on to the one thing I had left, my will to leave. And for one fleeting moment, I was free. When I opened my eyes again, I wasn't sure where I was anymore. The air was thick, heavier than before, suffocating in its stillness. The door to the lighthouse was now closed, the figure still somewhere in the darkness behind me, but the space around me had changed. It felt like the walls themselves were shifting, stretching, expanding, like the lighthouse wasn't just a building, but something alive, something that grew and shrank with its own will. I could feel the floor beneath me, cold and wet, like the sea had spilled inside. It was an eerie, unnatural sensation, as if the very foundation of this place was made of water, not stone. The shadows seemed to cling to me, wrapping themselves around my legs, tugging at my arms. Every movement felt labored, as if the very air was trying to hold me in place, to drag me into the depths of this dark place. I looked back, toward the place where the figure had stood. There was nothing there now, just the empty shadows stretching farther into the dark. Yet, I knew it was still there, watching. I wasn't alone. The whisper returned, louder this time, echoing through the space, reverberating inside my skull. It was everywhere, inside my head, in my ears, in the very walls around me. The voice was low, like the rumbling of thunder, but there was something else beneath it, an ancient hunger, a need. Why did you come? It asked again, its voice wrapping around my chest, squeezing the air from my lungs. I tried to answer, but the words wouldn't come. I didn't know why I came. I had been drawn here by the light, by something I couldn't understand. But now, standing in the dark, with the shadows closing in, I wished I had never stepped foot on that shore. I took a slow, trembling step forward, then another. My feet felt like they were sinking into the floor, like I was walking on something soft, something that wasn't solid. The whispers grew louder, filling the space, overwhelming me. The light. The light was still there, somewhere. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, a faint glow, pulling me, calling to me. I moved toward it, my body betraying me as it obeyed the pull. But with each step, the darkness seemed to stretch out farther, more insistent. The closer I got to the light, the more the shadows recoiled, like they feared it, like they were running from it. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whispers stopped. Silence. Complete and utter silence. I stopped, frozen in place, unsure of what to do next. The air was still thick, but now it felt different, like something had shifted. The weight that had pressed on me seemed lighter, as if the darkness had momentarily let go. And then I saw it. In the distance, near the top of the lighthouse, a flicker. The light. The beam, just as I had seen it on the shore, cutting through the blackness, slicing through the night. But this time, it wasn't a distant flicker. This time, the light was coming closer. The room around me seemed to pulse with the light's approach. It moved, not like a normal light, but like it was alive in a way that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't just illuminating the space, it was consuming it. The walls were shrinking, the shadows retreating, pulled into the very beam itself. The figure was gone, but the light, it was still here. It wasn't natural. It wasn't meant to exist. And then, the voice returned, no longer distant, but close. So close that I could feel it inside me. Come to me. It wasn't a command anymore. It was an invitation, sweet and heavy with promise. The light seemed to beckon, its glow intensifying, wrapping around me, pulling me closer, inch by inch. I could feel the pull now. It wasn't just in my mind, it was in my very bones, in the rhythm of my heartbeat, in the blood flowing through my veins. The light was calling to me, not with words, but with a need. It wanted me. It needed me. I reached out, my fingers trembling, not sure whether I was reaching for the light or trying to escape it. But there was no turning back. There was no escape. My body moved of its own accord, my feet dragging me toward the center of the room, where the light swirled and pulsed like a living thing. I could feel it wrapping around me, seeping into my skin, filling my chest, my lungs, my very soul. And then, as I stood there, frozen in the light's embrace, I saw something else. A shadow. It wasn't a figure, not like before, but something more, a mass, a shape that moved and shifted, like it was made of darkness itself. It hovered just beyond the light's reach, watching me, waiting. And in that moment, I realized the truth. The lighthouse didn't just pull people in. It kept them. It consumed them. And now, it was waiting for me to join it. The shadow in the corner of my vision grew darker, thicker, stretching out like an inkblot against the brilliance of the light. It wasn't moving in a way that made sense, not like any creature or thing I had ever seen. It was fluid, like smoke or fog, but it had a shape, an undeniable presence. It was there, watching me, waiting for me to understand. I tried to breathe, but my lungs felt heavy, as if the air had turned to lead. The light surrounded me now, blinding in its intensity, but the darkness was always just at the edge of my sight, lurking, its very presence a threat, a promise. The voice came again, deep, resonating from somewhere deep inside the earth. It wasn't asking me anymore. It was stating a truth, a fact I couldn't deny. You will stay. You belong here now. The words hit me like a wave, crashing over my mind, drowning my thoughts. The pull of the light was stronger than ever, overwhelming, but the darkness, the shadow, it called to something deep within me, something I couldn't explain. I wasn't sure how long I stood there, caught between the two forces, the light and the dark. Time didn't seem to exist here. I was lost in it, lost in the feeling of being both drawn in and repelled. The lighthouse, the very air, seemed to press down on me, to whisper promises and threats in the same breath. And then, in the distance, I saw something. A flicker. A flash of movement. A shape. For a second, I thought it was the figure again, the one I had seen before. But this time, it was different. This time, it wasn't just a figure. It was something more. A human form, but something was wrong with it. Its limbs were too long, too thin, and its face. I couldn't make it out clearly, but I could feel it watching me, its eyes empty, hollow. I stumbled back, my heart racing. Was this the fate that awaited me? Was this what the lighthouse did to those who came too close? Did it turn them into this? The voice was back again, sharper this time, more insistent. Join us, it commanded. You are not meant to leave. The shadows crept closer, curling around me like tendrils, suffocating, and the light, oh, the light, it was pulling me in, promising safety, warmth, something to hold on to. But I knew better now. The light wasn't safe. The light was part of this, part of the lure, part of the trap. I had to make a choice. The darkness pressed in on all sides, the air so thick I could taste it, and the light, it was brighter now, pulsing like a heartbeat, drawing me in. I could feel the warmth of it, the false comfort. I could feel it reaching inside me, drawing out my fears, my doubts, replacing them with nothing. A hollow emptiness, the same emptiness I had seen in the figure's eyes. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't be swallowed by it, consumed by the lighthouse. But I wasn't sure how to escape. I turned, my eyes scanning the room, searching for anything, any way out. The door was still there, just a few feet away, but the shadows were everywhere now, thickening, closing in. The light flickered, seemed to grow dimmer for a moment, as though it was aware of my thoughts, aware of my resistance. Leave, then, the voice said, almost amused now. But you will never truly be free. And then the light seemed to flare, a brilliant explosion of white that blinded me. I threw my arm up to shield my eyes, but it didn't help. It was as though the very light was inside me, consuming me from the inside out. I didn't know how, but somehow I stumbled forward, away from the light, away from the darkness. My legs moved, my feet carried me, but my mind screamed at me to stop. The door. I had to get to the door. I reached it. My hand fumbled for the handle, heart hammering in my chest, my breath ragged, but the door, it didn't open. I pulled harder. The wood groaned, the hinges protesting, but it wouldn't budge. The lighthouse wouldn't let me go. It had me, and it wasn't going to let go so easily. Stay, the voice whispered again, softer this time, as if it were lulling me to sleep. You belong here now. I slammed my shoulder against the door, pushing with all my strength, but it felt like the walls themselves were pushing back against me, the very fabric of the place refusing to let me leave. And then, a crack. A tiny, insignificant crack in the wall. Barely noticeable at first. But then it widened, and through it, I saw something. Something different. A sliver of light. Not the pulsing light of the lighthouse, but the light of the outside world, the world I had once known. I pushed harder, feeling the crack widen with every desperate shove. And then, finally, the door broke free. A rush of cold air, the scent of the sea, the sound of waves crashing against the shore. I stepped through, my body trembling from the weight of everything that had happened, my chest tight with fear. But as I stepped outside, I realized something. I wasn't alone. The shadow. It was still there, watching. And it wasn't just behind me anymore. It was beside me, following me. I had escaped the lighthouse, but I hadn't escaped the darkness. The cold air was a welcome relief, though it did little to calm the frantic beating of my heart. I stood on the shore, the ocean stretching endlessly before me, its waves crashing with a force that mirrored the turmoil inside me. I had escaped, at least, I thought I had. The lighthouse loomed behind me, silent now, its beacon extinguished, but I knew better. I knew it was still there, hidden in the shadows, waiting. I turned away, my eyes scanning the horizon, but the world around me felt wrong. The beach, the sky, even the very sound of the waves, All of it seemed distant, like a dream that was slowly fading. There was no warmth in the air, no reassurance in the natural world. The shadows followed me, not physically, but in my mind, a weight that pressed down on my thoughts. I had left the lighthouse, but I couldn't escape what it had done to me. The darkness hadn't just been inside the lighthouse. It had seeped into me, into my very soul. I took a step forward, then another, moving aimlessly, my eyes glued to the ground beneath me. The earth felt solid enough, but with every step, I felt a tremor beneath my feet, a faint shiver of the unknown. The shadows, that feeling of being watched, never left. A figure appeared ahead of me. I stopped dead in my tracks. It was vague at first, just a shape standing at the edge of the beach, but as my mind processed the image, I realized it was a person. A man, tall and thin, with no features that I could discern. His face was shadowed, his form indistinct, like a smear on the horizon. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry, my legs trembling. Was this another of the lighthouse's creations? Another victim, or was it something worse? He didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel his presence like a heavy weight pressing down on me. I knew he was waiting for me to approach, to draw closer. Something inside me screamed to run, to turn back to the lighthouse, to find some way to escape, but I couldn't. I couldn't tear my eyes away from him. "Why did you leave?" The voice came from him, soft yet deep, like it echoed from within the earth itself. I didn't answer. I couldn't. What could I say? That I had been forced to leave? That the lighthouse had broken me? That the light, the pull, had nearly consumed me? "You think you're free," the figure continued, his voice growing darker, filled with a coldness that chilled me to my core. "But the lighthouse doesn't let go that easily. You belong to it now. You always have." The words rang in my ears, an unbearable truth that twisted inside me. No. I had to be wrong. I had to be free. But I wasn't. I took a step back, but the figure moved too. His form shifted, closing the distance between us in a way that defied logic. He wasn't walking. He was gliding, moving with an unnatural smoothness, as though he didn't need the ground to hold him up. "You cannot outrun it," he said, his voice now like the sound of dry leaves scraping against the earth. "It is inside you. It will always be inside you." I could feel the darkness, the same one I had left behind, creeping back into my chest. It was a cold, gnawing emptiness, a hunger that couldn't be satisfied, no matter how far I ran. It was the lighthouse, its pull, its thirst for something, someone. It wanted me. I turned away from the figure, unable to look at him anymore, unable to stand his words. I needed to escape. But there was nowhere to run. The beach stretched endlessly in front of me, the ocean a dark, endless void. The lighthouse was still there, looming in the distance, just beyond the horizon of my mind, pulling at me, calling me back. I ran. The sand was wet beneath my feet, each step sinking deeper into the ground, slowing me down, dragging me back. My breath came in sharp, panicked gasps, my chest tight with fear. But the faster I ran, the stronger the pull became, the louder the whispers. "Stay," the voice said, soft and soothing. "Come back to us. You are one of us." I could feel it now, the heavy weight of the shadows pressing down on me from all sides. They had followed me. They had always been there. There was no escaping them. No escaping it. And then I felt it, cold fingers brushing against my skin, not from behind, but from within, as if the darkness was inside me, curling around my heart, tightening, suffocating. I fell to my knees, the weight of it too much, the pull too strong. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The lighthouse, the light, the shadows, it was all one thing, one force, and I was part of it now. There was no escape. And as the darkness closed in around me, I knew one thing for certain, I was never going to leave. The lighthouse had claimed me. It always would. I had always taken the elevator at my apartment building, mostly out of laziness. The building wasn't the newest, but it wasn't falling apart either. It was just ordinary. But that day, something unusual happened, something that changed everything. It started like any other afternoon. I pressed the button for the 5th floor. But as the doors closed and the elevator began its ascent, I did something strange. Without thinking, my finger brushed against the button for the 13th floor. I had never noticed it before, and I wasn't sure why I pressed it, but the moment I did, I felt a subtle shift in the air. The elevator jerked slightly as it moved past the 5th floor, then the 6th, the 7th. It didn't stop at the 8th floor like it was supposed to. Instead, it kept rising, much faster now, until it reached the 13th. The doors opened. I stepped out, expecting to see the usual corridor of my building, but something was wrong. The hallway was dim, the lights flickering like a dying candle. It looked almost identical to the real 13th floor, but there was an unnatural stillness to it, an unsettling quiet. The walls were the same, the carpet the same dull beige, but everything felt off. I stepped forward, my heart beating faster for no reason I could explain. The air was thick, as though the space around me was holding its breath. There was a faint, odd smell too, like stale water mixed with something metallic, like iron. I tried to shake off the sense of unease, but it lingered. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet beneath me. The doors to the apartments all seemed the same, yet something about them made my skin crawl. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The numbers on the doors were all familiar, but the way they looked etched too deeply into the wood, as if carved by a hand that had no care for precision, disturbed me. Then I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible noise. At first, I thought it was just the old building settling, the usual creaks and groans. But as I walked further down the hall, the sound became clearer, a faint scratching, like someone, dragging something heavy across the floor. I froze. The sound stopped immediately. For a moment, everything was silent again. But then I noticed something. The door at the end of the hall was ajar, just slightly. No one had ever lived in that apartment, not in the year I had lived here. I had never seen anyone go in or out. But now, the door was open, just enough to show a sliver of darkness beyond. I couldn't resist. I moved toward it, my pulse quickening with every step. I reached out for the door, my fingers trembling, and pushed it open. The room beyond was just like the others, familiar, yet completely wrong. It was small, with plain furniture and faded curtains. But the walls, they were covered in something. At first, I thought it was paint, but as I stepped closer, I realized it was something else. Scratches. Deep, jagged marks carved into the walls, as if someone had tried to escape, tried to claw their way out. And the smell, it was stronger now. More metallic, more overpowering. It made me dizzy. I stepped back, my heart racing. What was happening? How could a place so similar to my own apartment building feel so foreign? That's why I saw it. In the corner of the room, just barely visible in the dim light, was a figure. A person, no, a shape, huddled on the floor. It was still, unnervingly still, and it didn't move when I stepped closer. I took another step. My breath caught in my throat. The figure's face was pressed to the floor, its body twisted at an unnatural angle. The skin on its back was torn, raw, as if it had been scraped against something rough. But its face, I couldn't make it out. The shadows played tricks, distorting the features, but one thing was clear. The face was covered in blood, and its eyes were wide open, but lifeless. I staggered back, horrified. Suddenly, I heard the soft creak of the elevator behind me. I turned, my heart pounding, and saw the doors closing. Without thinking, I ran toward it. My legs felt heavy, as if I were wading through water, but I pushed myself faster. I reached the elevator, but the doors had already shut, leaving me with nothing but the darkness of the hallway behind me. I turned back toward the room, but the door was now closed. Tight. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever. I couldn't remember how I had gotten here, how I had ended up in this strange, distorted version of my building. The elevator had taken me somewhere that wasn't real, or maybe it was, but in a twisted, horrific way. I was trapped. And the worst part? I wasn't sure if I was even still on the 13th floor. Everything was wrong, distorted, but it looked so familiar. I wasn't sure what was real anymore. And I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I stood frozen in front of the elevator, my heart pounding in my chest. The silence of the hallway stretched out, heavy and oppressive. I turned back toward the door of the apartment I had just left. It was closed now, the dark room hidden behind it, but I couldn't shake the image of the lifeless face staring at me through the shadows. I wanted to run, to escape this nightmare, but where could I go? This floor, no, this place, it didn't feel like any reality I knew. The walls felt like they were closing in, and the air was thick, like it had been stale for decades. I couldn't hear the sounds of the building I was used to, the hum of the lights, the occasional murmur of neighbors, nothing. I walked slowly down the hallway, trying to ignore the creeping dread that crawled up my spine. Every door seemed the same, nondescript, anonymous. The scratched numbers, the worn-out wood, the muffled voices coming from behind the doors. I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as if the very air around me was charged with something unnatural. I turned the corner at the end of the hall, expecting to find the stairwell door, or at least another elevator, but instead, there was just a narrow passage that seemed to lead deeper into the building. It was strange. I knew the layout of this place. I had lived here for years. But none of this felt right. The hallway stretched on further than it should have. It shouldn't have been this long. Something caught my eye at the far end of the passage, a flickering light coming from underneath the door. My heart skipped a beat. The faintest sliver of light, like a tiny crack, illuminated the otherwise pitch-black space. I walked toward it, my footsteps unnervingly loud in the silence. As I neared the door, I noticed something even stranger. The door frame was crooked, almost like it had been pulled from its hinges, yet it stood perfectly still. The door itself was a deep shade of red, an unnatural hue that made the back of my throat tighten. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering near the doorknob. I wanted to leave. I wanted to turn and run back to the elevator, but the pull of curiosity was stronger. What was beyond that door? My hand shook as I grasped the doorknob and turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a room that shouldn't exist. It was a small, cramped space, but it was wrong. The furniture was out of place, misaligned, mismatched. It looked like someone had tried to set up a living room in a room that was far too small for it, but there was something more disturbing about it. The furniture was all turned slightly, as though trying to look at me, to observe me. The room smelled even worse here, like something rotting, decay mixed with something sweet and metallic. I could feel my stomach turn, my body screaming at me to get out of there. But then I saw it. On the far wall, there was a large mirror. At first, I thought it was just an old, cracked piece of glass, but as I stared at it, I realized that the reflection wasn't right. It was me, yes, but my reflection looked distorted. My movements were delayed, jerky, as though it were a step behind me. But what made my skin crawl was the figure that stood beside my reflection. A person. Someone tall, dressed in black, their features obscured in the darkened reflection, but their eyes, those eyes, were fixed on me, watching. There was no one behind me in the room, no one else standing there, but in the reflection, the figure was there, inches from my back. I spun around, heart hammering, but the room was empty. I slammed the door shut, my breath coming in quick gasps. The hallway felt even more suffocating now. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of here, but I didn't know how. I wasn't sure if the elevator would even be able to take me back to my real world. As I turned to head back down the hall, I heard it again. That sound. It was faint, but it was there, scratching. Like something dragging its fingers across the floor, something moving just out of sight. It was behind me. I couldn't bring myself to look back. My legs felt like lead as I stumbled toward the elevator. The sound was getting louder, closer, until I could almost feel the cold touch of whatever it was on the back of my neck. The elevator doors opened just as I reached it, as if waiting for me. I stepped inside, my eyes scanning the dimly lit hallway for any sign of movement, but the elevator's soft chime was the only thing I could hear now. The doors slid shut, and the elevator began its descent. I pressed the button for the ground floor, my hands trembling. As the elevator descended, I thought I could hear something from above. A low, almost imperceptible humming, like the elevator was trying to fight its way back up. And then, as the doors opened to the familiar ground floor, I saw it. The hallway, my hallway, was not the same. The door to the stairwell was slightly ajar, and there was a figure standing there, staring at me. It wasn't just a stranger. It was the same figure I had seen in the reflection, standing motionless in the shadows. But now it was real. And it was waiting. I froze. The figure standing in the doorway wasn't just a shadow anymore, it was real. The same tall, dark shape, with its face obscured by the dim light of the hallway. Its eyes, though, those eyes, still glowed with an unsettling intensity, just as they had in the reflection. It stood perfectly still, as though it had been waiting for me. I didn't move. My breath caught in my chest, and my hands shook so violently I had to grip the elevator rail to keep myself from collapsing. The figure didn't speak. It didn't move. It just watched. For a long moment, all I could do was stare back, too terrified to even look away. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like they were made of stone, unwilling to respond to my frantic thoughts. Then, I noticed something worse. The hallway wasn't empty. Other doors, once closed, were now slightly ajar, just like the one I had passed earlier. Behind each door, there were shapes. Shadows. Figures that seemed to blur and warp as they moved within the rooms, their outlines shifting in ways that didn't make sense. There was no sound, just the haunting stillness of the place. I glanced back at the figure. It hadn't moved, but now it seemed closer, as if it had somehow come into the hallway without me noticing. Its presence felt like a weight pressing against me. The elevator doors were still open behind me, but the thought of stepping back in was as terrifying as staying out. I had no idea where I was anymore. No idea if anything outside this building even existed. Was this another floor? Another dimension? A twisted reflection of my world? I needed to escape. There was no choice. I took a slow step toward the door to the stairwell, my feet dragging against the floor. I didn't dare take my eyes off the figure, though I could sense it was moving, following me with its unblinking gaze. But as I reached the door, I heard a faint sound from behind me. It wasn't footsteps. It was a whisper. A low, breathy whisper that sounded like it was coming from all around me. "It's not over." I spun around, but the hallway was empty. The figure had disappeared. I felt the air shift, like the building had exhaled, leaving behind only silence. My heartbeat pounded in my ears as I opened the stairwell door and stepped inside. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The building felt like it was alive, watching me, and every step I took seemed to echo, louder and louder, as though it was drawing attention to my every move. I ran down the stairs, my legs aching, my breath ragged. The further I descended, the more the air thickened, the more the walls seemed to close in on me. I wasn't sure how far I had gone, but I didn't dare stop. I needed to get out. I needed to reach the ground floor and escape this place, this other world that seemed so close to my own but so undeniably wrong. When I reached the bottom, I burst through the door to the ground floor. The lights flickered, casting the hallway in harsh, unwelcoming shadows. But the building was still the same. It was familiar, comforting even. I could hear people talking in their apartments. The hum of life. The normalcy. I let out a shaky breath, realizing I had been holding it. I was home. Or at least, it felt like home. I was back where I belonged. But something was wrong. I looked around. The hallway seemed endless now, stretching much farther than it should. The walls were too high. The doors too far apart. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the elevator, the one I had just taken, wasn't really down here with me. A low hum, like the one I'd heard earlier, filled the air. It was faint at first, barely noticeable, but it was there, vibrating beneath the silence. My hands went cold, my stomach flipping as I turned toward the elevator shaft. The doors were closed, but I could hear it. A sound like something heavy scraping against metal. A slow, deliberate sound like claws dragging along the floor. It was coming from inside the elevator shaft. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. Something had followed me down here. Something from that other place. I needed to leave, but where could I go? I turned to the stairwell, but I felt it before I saw it. A shadow. A figure standing just beyond the door, blocking the exit. Its outline was fuzzy, indistinct, like a mirage. But the eyes, those eyes, I saw them clearly. They were the same. Watching me. Waiting for me. The whisper came again. "You can't leave." I froze. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. The figure stepped forward, its presence flooding the space around me. And I realized then, I wasn't in my world anymore. I had never truly left. The place I had stepped into, the one with the flickering lights and endless hallways, that was my world now. It had claimed me, and there was no way back. The ground beneath my feet shifted. I felt the pull, like gravity was changing, bending. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. Everything around me began to distort. The walls stretched. The floor cracked open. I saw the figure again, but this time it wasn't the only one. There were others, rising from the shadows, their eyes glowing as they circled around me. And the last thing I heard before everything went dark was the same whisper. "Welcome home." When I opened my eyes again, everything was wrong. I wasn't in the stairwell anymore. The familiar, comforting hallways of the ground floor had disappeared, replaced by something far worse. I was back in the building, yes, but it felt like it had expanded, twisted itself into something unrecognizable. I stood up, disoriented. The floor beneath me felt soft, almost spongy, like walking on wet sand. The air was thick, like I was breathing through cloth. My body felt heavier, weighed down by something invisible. The walls that surrounded me were warped, curved unnaturally. They stretched and contracted, as though the building was alive, pulsing with each beat of my heart. I stumbled forward, my mind racing. Where was I? What was happening? As I walked, I noticed the doors. They were different, stranger, more foreign. They had no numbers, no names. Just plain wood, stained with something dark that looked like blood. But the strangest part was that the doors didn't lead to anywhere I recognized. Behind them, there was no sound, no murmurs, no footsteps. Just silence, heavy and thick, like the world had become hollow. I reached for one of the doors, my hand trembling as I grasped the handle. The wood was cold, slick with something. Was it water? I pulled the door open. The room inside was empty, save for a single chair in the center. It was made of dark, polished wood, but it was covered in deep cracks, as if it had been abandoned for decades. The chair sat under a flickering light bulb, its dim light casting strange shadows on the walls. I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing loudly in the stillness. "Hello?" I called out, my voice weak and hollow in the oppressive silence. Nothing. But then I heard it. A faint creak. At first, I thought it was just the old chair settling. But then it came again, louder this time, a soft scrape, like something shifting behind me. I spun around, my heart thundering in my chest. There was no one there. Yet, the air felt heavy with a presence I couldn't explain. The silence pressed in around me, thick and suffocating. I turned toward the door, ready to leave, but as I moved toward it, I felt it, a cold, creeping sensation along my spine, like something was watching me. I stopped, my heart racing as I scanned the empty room. The shadows seemed to lengthen, creeping across the floor in a way that defied logic. I turned back to the chair. The creaking sound was louder now, almost rhythmic. It was as though the chair was slowly rocking back and forth, despite there being no one sitting in it. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping rapidly. And then I saw it. A shadow, faint at first, but growing more distinct as it took shape. A figure, standing in the corner of the room, just outside the reach of the light. It was tall, like the others, but its features were even more distorted. Its face was obscured by darkness, its body unnaturally long and thin. Its arms were outstretched, twitching, as if it were trying to reach for me. And its eyes, those eyes, glowed with an unnatural light, the same sickly glow I had seen in the reflection. I froze, unable to move. The whisper came again. "You're here now. There's no way out." I wanted to scream, to run, to escape, but my body wouldn't obey. The room seemed to close in on me, the walls pressing forward, the shadows reaching for me, dragging me deeper into their grip. I stumbled back toward the door, but before I could reach it, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. It was light at first, almost gentle, like a whisper of wind, but it sent a jolt of ice through my veins. I spun around, but there was no one there. Just the air, thick and suffocating, pressing against me. "You can't leave." The voice was clearer now, closer, as though it was coming from inside my own mind. I pushed myself toward the door with every ounce of strength I had left. My body was shaking, my legs unsteady. I yanked the door open and bolted into the hallway, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But the hallway was no longer the same. The walls were shifting, bending, the doors now open, revealing nothing but darkness. I ran. My footsteps were loud and frantic, reverberating in the hallway like a drumbeat. I had no idea where I was going, only that I had to keep moving, that stopping would mean I would never escape. I turned a corner, but the hallway didn't end. It just stretched on, impossibly long, like I was running in circles. I turned another corner, only to find the same hallway. The same doors. The same darkness. It felt like the building itself was changing around me, the walls breathing, pulling me deeper into its depths. And then, just as I thought I might collapse from exhaustion, I saw something. At the far end of the hallway, a door. A real door, one that looked like it might lead somewhere I recognized. I ran toward it, desperate. The doors to the rooms on either side slammed shut as I passed, as though they were trying to trap me, to keep me inside. But I didn't look back. When I reached the door, I threw it open, only to be met by a blinding light. I stepped through, blinking against the brightness. The light seemed endless, overwhelming. It surrounded me, filling my vision, drowning out everything else. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the light faded. I was outside. The air was crisp, cool, and I could feel the familiar weight of the world pressing down on me. But the building, it was gone. There was no trace of it. No sign that it had ever existed. I was standing in an empty street, the pavement cracked and abandoned. The silence was deafening. I was alone. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath, my mind reeling. I didn't know how I had gotten here, but I knew one thing for sure. I was no longer part of the world I once knew. The other world, the one I had wandered into, was still waiting for me. And the figure, the eyes that followed me, the whispers that never stopped, they were never going to let me go. I sat there on the cracked pavement, the weight of what had happened pressing on me. My body ached, and my mind felt foggy, as though I had been in a dream or a nightmare, so long that I couldn't tell what was real anymore. My heart still raced, my breath uneven. The world around me seemed too quiet, too still, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for something. But then it hit me. The building wasn't gone. I could still feel it, looming behind me, just out of sight. The faint hum of the lights, the strange shadows that hadn't left me, the cold that never truly went away. It was all still there, waiting. And the figure I had seen, those eyes, that presence, they hadn't disappeared. They were still with me, following me like a curse. I stood up, wiping the dirt from my knees, my thoughts racing. I needed to leave this place, to get away from whatever it was that had taken me. I glanced around, but there was nothing familiar about the street. The buildings were unfamiliar, the street lights dim and flickering in the distance. The air had a stale, metallic taste to it, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the world was wrong, out of sync. I started walking, my steps slow at first, hesitant. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to move. My mind kept flashing back to the elevator, to the doors that shouldn't have opened, to the hallway that seemed to stretch on forever. The whispers followed me, soft at first, like distant echoes in my mind, but they grew louder with each step. You're not alone. It's coming for you. I quickened my pace, my breath catching in my throat. The ground beneath me seemed to pulse, shifting beneath my feet, as if the entire city was alive, and I was just a part of its game. I didn't know how long I had been walking, but it felt like hours. The streets were empty, too empty. There were no people, no sounds, no signs of life. It was as if the world had been abandoned, as though I was the last person left. I turned a corner and saw something that made my blood run cold. There, standing at the end of the street, was the building. The same one. The same twisted, distorted shape that had haunted me before. The windows were dark, the doors closed, but I knew it. I could feel it. I couldn't escape it. The whispers were louder now, a constant hum in my ears. They had followed me here, back to this place. The eyes. The figures. They were waiting, watching. You can't run. It's always with you. I backed away, but my legs felt heavy, sluggish. I stumbled, my mind racing, trying to find a way out. But no matter how far I ran, the building was always there, just around the corner, looming over me. It was like a part of me had been pulled into it, and no matter how much I tried to escape, it would always find me. The air grew colder again, and the lights above flickered. I could see the shadows moving, creeping closer. Figures began to emerge from the darkened doorways of the building, their faces obscured by the night. They didn't move like people. They were wrong. Their bodies twisted and contorted in unnatural ways, their eyes glowing, watching me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay here. The building, the other world, was closing in on me, suffocating me, pulling me back in. I could hear the whispers growing louder, the figures drawing closer. They were coming for me. And then, just as I thought I couldn't go any further, I heard it. A door. A real door. One that seemed to lead somewhere familiar, somewhere safe. I reached for the handle, desperate, pulling it open with shaking hands. And the light flooded back in. For a brief moment, I thought I was free. The light was warm, familiar, and I stepped through, feeling the air shift around me. But then the door slammed shut behind me. I turned, expecting to find myself in a new world, but instead, I was standing in the same hallway. The same warped, twisted place I had tried to escape. The building had pulled me back in, like it always had, like it always would. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure stood before me again, its glowing eyes locking onto mine, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The whispers filled my mind, drowning out my thoughts, suffocating me with their cold, hollow voices. You'll never escape. And in that moment, I realized the truth. There was no way out. There never had been. I had stepped into something far beyond my understanding, a world where I was trapped forever. A world where the building, the elevator, the doors, the figures were all just a part of the same nightmare. And I was never going to wake up. It was supposed to be a fresh start. After months of searching for the right place, I had finally found it. A house tucked away at the end of a quiet street, surrounded by tall trees that seemed to whisper secrets in the wind. The kind of house you could imagine finding in an old book, with ivy creeping up its brick walls and a rusted gate that squeaked in protest every time it was opened. I should have known something was wrong when a realtor mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that it was an old property. It wasn't unusual, of course, but something in her voice made me pause. She quickly changed the subject, but not before I caught a glimpse of something behind her smile, a trace of something that made the air in the room feel just a little bit heavier. But the house was beautiful, and I needed a place to stay, so I bought it without much hesitation. The first night was uneventful. I unpacked what little I had, settled into the bedroom with the creaky floorboards, and fell asleep to the soft hum of the house settling around me. The house, though old, felt oddly peaceful, almost comforting. The next morning, I woke up to the strange echo. I had just finished brushing my teeth when I called out to myself, just a casual hello to break the silence that had filled the house. It wasn't unusual for me to talk to myself all alone, especially when I was still adjusting to a new place. But the echo that followed wasn't mine. I froze, toothbrush halfway to my mouth, as the words bounced back to me. The tone was different, but the words were unmistakable. It was my voice, but somehow wrong. Hello. I turned around, expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty. My heart thudded in my chest as I listened closely. No sounds except the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant creak of the floorboards. Maybe it was a fluke, I told myself. Some odd quirk of acoustics in the house. But as the day wore on, the echoes grew more frequent, more unsettling. I would speak, just the usual, everyday things, and the echo would come back, always a moment later, but never quite in sync with me. What are you doing? I hadn't said that. I hadn't even thought it. The echo was wrong. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks. Maybe it was the isolation, the quiet, the newness of it all. But then, when I walked through the empty hallways, I started hearing the echoes in rooms where I wasn't. In the kitchen, as I moved to the sink, I heard a faint clink, like the sound of a cup being set down. But there was no cup. I checked every corner of the room, even opened the cabinets, but found nothing unusual. The feeling of unease lingered in the air, pressing on my chest like the weight of a storm. That night, I tried to ignore the strange noise in the house. The echoes, the whispers, they had become a part of the silence I had been hearing for days. I convinced myself that I was just adjusting to this new place. But then, as I lay in bed, the voice came again. This time, it was louder, clearer. Help me. I shot up, heart pounding, the blankets twisted around my legs. The voice wasn't my own. It wasn't even a voice I recognized. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild. But the voice had sounded too real, too close. I listened for a moment, straining to hear anything that might explain what was happening. But all I could hear was the soft rustling of the wind outside, the creaks of the house settling. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It felt like the house itself was speaking to me, echoing things that didn't belong. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was inside this place, something that had never really left. I didn't know what it was, but I could feel it watching me. The next few days were a blur. Each morning I woke with the weight of the previous night's unease hanging over me. The house felt colder than it should, and the echoes, once only strange, now began to feel threatening. I couldn't ignore them anymore. Every time I spoke, there was a response. Not my own voice, no. It was something else. Something old. I began to notice patterns. In the living room, the echo always mirrored my tone, but distorted it, twisting the words into something unfamiliar. When I said, "I'm just trying to settle in," the echo would return, but it sounded like, "I'm trapped here." I would jump, startled, but no one was there. Every corner of the house felt like it was holding something, hidden voices, lingering memories, old thoughts that hadn't fully faded. On the third day, I decided to investigate. I went into the basement, a cold, dark place that hadn't seen much light since I moved in. I was careful not to touch anything, my footsteps quiet as I descended into the damp, musty air. There were old boxes stacked against the far wall, a few forgotten pieces of furniture that had been abandoned years ago. But what caught my attention wasn't the clutter, it was the walls. The basement was small, and its walls were lined with wood paneling that had warped over time. They didn't just seem old, though. There was something off about them. The air felt heavier, as if the walls were pressing in, suffocating the space. I stood there for a long moment, listening. And then it came again. "Get out." The words were faint, but they were unmistakable. They came from the walls themselves, the wood seeming to vibrate with the force of them. My blood ran cold, and I stepped back, unsure of what to make of it. I rushed back upstairs, heart hammering in my chest. I needed to get out of this house, but it wasn't that easy. Something kept pulling me back, as though the house itself had taken root in me. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house had grown louder. The whispers had begun to take shape. It was no longer just echoes, it was like the house itself was alive. The voices came from every room, curling around me, filling my ears, urging me to listen, to stay. I moved through the halls, trying to ignore the prickling sensation on my skin. The walls seemed to shift while I wasn't looking, the shadows deepening in places they hadn't been before. "You're not alone." I froze at the doorway to the study. There, just past the threshold, a figure stood. A shadow, tall, thin, its shape not quite right, its edges blurring into the walls. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel its presence, cold and suffocating. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. "Help me," the voice was faint but distinct, coming from somewhere deep inside the house. My breath caught in my throat. I backed away slowly, not daring to take my eyes off the figure. But then the floor creaked under my feet, and I felt a chill rush over me. I turned and ran. The hallway stretched out endlessly, the walls closing in as I sprinted. I could hear the footsteps behind me, soft, but getting closer. The shadows shifted, and as I passed each door, I could feel them watching, listening. I reached the living room and slammed the door behind me, locking it, my heart racing. But as I stood there, gasping for breath, I realized something. The house was alive. The walls were speaking. They were holding something inside them, something that had been trapped here for years, something that had never left. And it wanted me to hear it. I wasn't just hearing echoes of my own voice. These were the voices of the people who had lived here before, the ones who had never truly left. And now they wanted me to join them. The following days were consumed by the overwhelming presence of the house. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, exhaustion, the isolation, the quietness of the place playing tricks on my mind. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Every corner of the house held its own secret, its own voice. And it was growing louder. The voices became more distinct. At first, they were whispers, faint enough to dismiss. But then, they started calling out by name. James. The first time it happened, I turned so quickly I nearly stumbled over my own feet. But no one was there. Just the house. The empty rooms, the flickering lights. The silence. I spent most of my time in the study after that, away from the living room, the kitchen, and the basement. It was the only place where I felt the house wasn't watching me, where the air didn't feel so thick. But even there, the echoes followed me. James, you shouldn't be here. That night, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to leave. I packed my things in a frenzy, throwing clothes into a suitcase, not even caring about being organized. The voices were closing in, growing desperate, like they knew I was about to escape. Stay. Please stay. The door to the outside was right there, just a few feet away. I reached for the handle, the cold metal biting into my skin as I pulled it open. The wind outside was sharp, the air heavy with the scent of rain. I stepped out, breathing in the cool night air. But the moment I crossed the threshold, I felt it. The pull. It was subtle at first, a tug at the back of my mind, a feeling that I wasn't free. I turned to look at the house, my house, now. The front door stood open, as though waiting for me to return. And I couldn't help myself. I walked back toward it. James. It was louder now, the voice unmistakable, right behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. The air was thick with a kind of electricity, a presence pressing down on me from every angle. The voices had found me again. I stepped inside the house, and immediately, I felt the change. The temperature dropped. The familiar surroundings grew darker, more oppressive. The walls seemed to pulse, as though they were breathing with me. I went back to the living room, my legs moving of their own accord. I had no control anymore. The house had me in its grip. Why did you leave? The voice was softer now, pleading. I didn't know what to do. I could still hear it, the voices swirling around me, each one pulling at me, trying to keep me here. They were in the walls, in the floorboards, in the very air I breathed. I could feel their presence, these lost souls, trapped in the house, forever echoing their final words. I ran to the basement, the only place I hadn't yet dared to explore fully. If the voices were inside the house, maybe I could find a way to stop them. Maybe if I understood what had happened here, I could get rid of them. The basement was colder than I remembered, the air thick with dust and something else, something rancid. I lit a candle and set it down on the concrete floor, my hand shaking as I surveyed the room. There, hidden behind a stack of old crates, was a door. I had never noticed it before. It was small, barely visible, tucked away in the corner. I approached it slowly, my heart racing. The voices grew louder, more urgent. Don't go in there. But I couldn't stop myself. I turned the knob and pushed the door open. It was a crawl space, narrow and suffocating, the walls closing in around me as I crawled forward. There was something at the end of the space, a small wooden chest, covered in layers of dust. The voices whispered faster now, louder. They were all around me, choking me, begging me to turn back. but I reached the chest. My hands trembled as I opened it, revealing a small, leather-bound book. The moment I touched it, the air shifted. The voices stopped. And then I heard something else. A low, guttural sound from somewhere deep in the house. It was a growl. A rumble, like the house itself was waking up. And then the walls screamed. The scream echoed through every inch of the house. It wasn't just a sound, it was a sensation. A pressure that crushed my chest, squeezing the breath out of me. The walls seemed to vibrate, their very structure trembling, as if the house itself was alive. The voices had been silenced for a brief moment, but now they returned, louder, more desperate. You shouldn't have opened it. I dropped the book, the leather cover cold under my fingers. The voices swirled around me, chaotic, pleading. Some were angry, some mournful, others simply echoing fragments of their lost lives. I scrambled back, my mind racing. What had I done? What was this place? What was this house? The ground beneath me shook, and I could hear footsteps, heavy, dragging, as though something, or someone, was moving through the house. I didn't want to know what it was, but I knew I had to leave. I had to get out. I stumbled backward into the basement, my feet slipping over the uneven floor, and the book that I had dropped lay open on the ground. The air around me was thick, suffocating. Every breath felt like it could be my last. I glanced at the pages of the book, but I couldn't focus on the words. The growl I heard earlier was growing louder, closer. I could feel it in my bones. Don't run. The whisper was almost sweet, but it sent chills down my spine. I turned and ran, not looking back. My heart pounded in my ears as I rushed up the stairs, the house growing around me as though the very walls were alive, responding to my fear. The kitchen door slammed shut in front of me as I tried to escape, as if the house was closing in, locking me in. My pulse hammered in my throat. The lights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. The atmosphere in the house had changed completely. It was no longer just the voices. Now, it was the house itself, hungry and waiting. I stumbled into the living room, my breath coming in ragged gasps, only to be confronted by something I couldn't explain. The walls were shifting. The patterns on the wallpaper were warping and twisting, like faces emerging from the surface. Faces I had never seen, but felt as if I knew them. Their eyes followed me, their lips moving as they whispered to each other. "You've disturbed it." The words came from everywhere, all at once. I pressed myself against the far wall, trying to steady myself, but the temperature dropped. My breath came out in visible clouds. I had to get out. But every exit seemed blocked, every doorway a dead end. "You can't leave." I spun around, only to find a figure standing in the doorway, its face obscured by shadows. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence. The voice that came from it was deep, almost like a growl, but still somehow familiar. "You are part of it now." I stepped back, my eyes locked on the figure, my body frozen. The air around me seemed to thicken. The walls closed in, the sounds grew louder, the whispers, the shuffling, the heavy steps. The growl that had started in the basement was now all around me. "Stay with us," the voice beckoned. I turned and ran again, bolting through the hallway, trying every door, every window. Nothing would open. The house was alive, and it was keeping me here. My heart was racing, my body trembling with fear, but the house was relentless. The walls seemed to stretch, the rooms endless. I felt like I was running in circles, trapped in an impossible maze. I stumbled into the front hall again, and that's when I saw it. The doorway. It was open. But the house wasn't the same anymore. The outside world was no longer there. The sky had darkened, and there was a heavy, suffocating fog in the air. The house wasn't just blocking my way, it had shifted. It had changed. I stepped forward, my foot hitting the threshold, but the moment I did, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening crash. The growl from deep within the house returned, louder now, filling the air, filling my mind. It wasn't just the house anymore. It was something else, something that had always been here, hidden beneath the walls. And now it had me. You're ours now. I could feel the walls pulse around me. The voices, the figures, they were all closing in. I wasn't sure where the house ended and where I began anymore. Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet gave way, and I fell, the darkness swallowing me whole. I woke with a jolt, gasping for air, my body cold and trembling. For a brief, fleeting moment, I thought I had escaped, that I was outside, safe, and the house had just been a bad dream. But when I opened my eyes, I was back in the living room. The same walls, the same heavy air. The same oppressive silence. No, it wasn't the same. It had changed. The house had shifted again. I pushed myself to my feet, the world spinning as I steadied myself. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a loud, desperate thrum that reverberated through my entire body. I reached out to touch the wall, and my hand met something wrong. The surface was soft, like wet fabric. The walls were breathing, alive in a way that defied logic. I recoiled, fear bubbling up, crawling up my throat like a suffocating hand. You never should have come. The voice was no longer just a whisper. It was a presence, an unearthly force that seemed to seep into my very being. The growl was gone now, replaced by a calm, eerie quiet. I could feel it, something was watching me, something that was both inside and outside of me, something that had always been here, and now it had claimed me. I stumbled through the house, my mind racing for an escape. I reached the front door again. The handle felt cold, and when I turned it, it didn't budge. The door didn't open. It was as if the house itself was holding me captive, trapping me in its endless maze. The house no longer resembled anything familiar. The furniture had changed, the walls warped into grotesque shapes, and the air was thick with an oppressive pressure. I felt like I was drowning, suffocating beneath its weight. The very essence of the house was alive, breathing, twisting. The voices, no longer whispers, were now full-fledged conversations, echoes from the past. I could hear them all at once, fragments of old arguments, laughter, cries of fear. All the people who had lived here before me, all their emotions had become part of this house. I was surrounded by them. Stay with us. Stay, the voices whispered from every corner. I ran, not knowing where to go anymore, desperate for freedom. But there was no way out. Every room I entered led to another, each one more distorted than the last. I couldn't tell what was real. Was I still in the house? Was I dreaming? Or was I becoming part of it, part of the voices that haunted these walls? I stumbled into the study, my legs weak beneath me, and the moment I crossed the threshold, I saw it. The book. The one I had dropped in the basement. It was on the desk, open, as if waiting for me. And there, beneath the pages, was something written in red ink. You are now one of us. I reached for it, my fingers trembling, and as soon as I touched the pages, the world around me shifted again. The room spun, the walls closing in, suffocating me. The voices, the growls, the presence, it was all merging, becoming one, a single, unrelenting force. And then, I understood. The house wasn't just haunted by the spirits of the past. It was feeding off them, feeding off me. I had become a part of the house, a part of the endless echo that would never stop. The voices weren't just trapped here, they were bound to it, feeding into its power, making it stronger, more alive. The house had no end. It was a loop, a prison. And now I was trapped in it, forever. I could hear the voices clearly now, each one calling my name. They had become my own. I was no longer an observer. I was part of the sound, part of the air, part of the house. You will never leave. The walls pulsed one final time, and the room grew dark. The book closed, its cover snapping shut, and the last echo faded. There was only silence. But it wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of a house that had consumed its own. And now, it was waiting for the next person to hear its call. I've always hated the night shift. The office is empty, the lights dimmed, and the world outside is silent. It feels like you're the last person left on Earth, trapped in a building with nothing but the hum of machines for company. But tonight something feels different. I'm Jake, the night security guard at a small office building on the outskirts of town. It's not a glamorous job, but it pays the bills. My routine is simple: patrol the halls, monitor the cameras, and make sure no one breaks in. Most of the time, it's boring. Sometimes, I even nod off at my desk. But tonight, something's off. I was checking the monitors when I noticed something strange. One of the screens was showing the main hallway. That's nothing new. I've seen it 1,000 times. But this time, it wasn't me walking down the hall. It was someone else. A figure, tall, dressed in dark clothes, moving slowly, almost methodically. It seemed familiar, but something about the way they moved felt wrong. I leaned closer, my breath catching in my throat. I reached for the camera controls and switched to another angle. The same figure, now standing in front of the elevator. But I knew there was no one there. No one had been in the building for hours. It was just me. I checked the time. It was 1:30 in the morning, and I hadn't seen anyone else around. I rubbed my eyes, convinced it was some trick of the light, maybe a glitch in the system. But the figure didn't disappear. It stood there, motionless, staring into the elevator doors. A chill crept up my spine. My fingers hovered over the control panel as I switched between cameras, trying to find another angle, but every screen showed the same thing. The figure, now closer, walking down the hall toward my desk. My pulse quickened. There was no way. No way anyone could be here. I'm the only one left. The building's security system is locked down at night, and there's no way anyone could have snuck past me without triggering the alarms. Yet, there it was, on the screen, coming closer. I stood up, heart pounding, and took a few cautious steps toward the hallway. My shoes echoed loudly against the cold, hard floors. I reached the door to the hallway and peered into the dark corridor. Nothing. Just the faint glow of the exit signs. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I jumped. It was a message from my boss. Everything good? I typed back quickly, yeah, everything's fine. But even as I typed, I knew something wasn't right. I could still feel the weight of those eyes on me, though the hallway remained empty. I glanced back at the monitor. The figure was gone, but the feeling of unease hadn't left. My breath came in shallow bursts, and I had to force myself to sit back down. What was going on? Was I seeing things? Was it just fatigue messing with my head? I tried to shake it off. It had to be a malfunction. I got up again and walked toward the break room to grab some coffee, hoping the caffeine would clear my head. As I passed the elevator, I glanced up at the monitor above it. The figure was there again, standing inside the elevator, staring back at me. I froze. It wasn't just in the hallway anymore. It was in the elevator, watching me. And worse, its reflection in the elevator door was different. The figure in the elevator wasn't moving like the one on the cameras. Its head tilted to the side, unnaturally, as if studying me. I ran back to my desk, my hands shaking as I reached for the intercom to call for help. But before I could press the button, the figure in the elevator shifted. It turned its head sharply and looked directly at me through the monitor. I swear, I could hear its breath. Steady, heavy, almost in time with my own. I backed away from the desk, my body cold with fear. What was happening? And then the elevator door opened. But there was no one there. I swallowed hard, staring at the empty elevator. Everything was still. My heart pounded in my ears as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Was it a prank? Some kind of glitch? But no. I knew this building. I knew its layout. No one else was here. That's when the whispering started. It was quiet at first, just a murmur in the air, but then it grew louder. It was like a chorus of voices, all overlapping, speaking in different languages, different tones. And then I heard it. My name. Spoken softly, but unmistakably. Jake. I spun around, looking for the source. The building was still, unnaturally so. The hum of the machines, the flickering lights, everything seemed to have stopped. The whispering was louder now, more urgent, and it came from every direction. From the walls. From the screens. From the floor beneath my feet. I ran. I ran without thinking. I couldn't breathe. I needed to get out. But no matter where I went, the voice followed. My own voice. Jake. Jake. The echo was always just behind me, growing louder with every step, until it filled my ears. It wasn't coming from the monitors anymore. It was coming from the building itself, from the air around me. It was me, but it wasn't. I reached the exit door, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the handle. But it wouldn't open. I turned and looked at the monitors one last time. And there it was. The figure again, but this time standing in front of my desk, facing the camera. It was me. Or at least, it looked like me. But I wasn't standing there. I was here, in front of the door, trying to escape. The figure moved. Slowly. Methodically. And it spoke. You never leave. I gasped, my heart stopping in my chest. And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything went silent. The screens went black. The whispering stopped. The elevator doors closed. And for a moment, I thought it was over. I thought I was safe. But the feeling lingered. The presence. The knowledge that something was watching me, waiting. I looked back at the door, and in the reflection of the glass, I saw it again. The figure. And it was standing right behind me. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight as I stared at the figure in the reflection, its presence looming like a shadow, too close, too real. I turned slowly, my heart thudding in my ears. The hallway behind me was empty, just the usual sterile white walls and flickering fluorescent lights. But the sense of something being there, something wrong, never left. I turned back to the glass, half expecting to see it vanish, but no, there it was. The reflection was still there, standing just behind me. The figure's eyes, if it even had eyes, pierced through the glass like a predator hunting its prey. I reached for the door handle again, this time with more urgency, but my fingers were trembling so badly that I couldn't get a grip. It was like my mind was stuck in some kind of loop. I had to get out. I needed to leave. But there was something about the reflection, something that kept pulling me back. The air around me felt dense, almost suffocating. The hum of the office lights, the flicker of the monitors, all faded into the background as I stood frozen, staring at myself in that reflective surface. Was that really me? No. No, it couldn't be. I felt a chill run through me, the same way you feel when you know you're being watched but can't quite place from where. I tried to shake the thought out of my head. I needed to stay calm. I had to get out of here. Finally, my hand found the handle, and I yanked the door open with all my strength, stumbling into the hallway. The building was eerily quiet, like it was holding its breath, waiting. I hurried down the corridor, each footstep echoing louder than the last. As I passed by the break room, I froze. Through the frosted glass, I could see a shape moving. It was small, shifting just behind the door. My pulse quickened. I didn't want to go in there, but something inside me told me I had to check. I pushed the door open, the handle turning under my sweaty palm. The room was empty, except for the monitors mounted on the wall. They flickered faintly, showing only static. But the strangest thing was the small desk in the corner. It was positioned oddly, facing the wall, with something on top of it. I approached cautiously, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. On the desk, a small notepad lay open, and in the center of the page, written in bold, hurried handwriting, were 2 words. Help me. My stomach twisted into a knot. This wasn't here before. It couldn't have been. I hadn't been in this room in hours. I picked up the notepad, my fingers trembling as I stared at the message. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Who wrote this? Why was it here? I turned to leave, my body tensing as I heard a soft thud from behind me. My breath caught in my throat, and I spun around to face the monitors. One of the screens was showing the hallway again. But something was different. There, on the screen, was the figure from before. The one that looked like me. But now, it wasn't just standing in the hallway. It was moving, slowly creeping toward my desk. I could see the reflection in the glass, its distorted image growing closer, inch by inch. I was paralyzed. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the screen, watching as the figure crossed the hallway and stopped right in front of my desk. I felt like I was suffocating, trapped between the 2 worlds, the one I was in and the one the monitors were showing me. The figure in the hallway turned its head, slowly, deliberately, and looked directly at the camera. It was like it knew I was watching. And then it smiled. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. I turned and bolted down the hall, my shoes pounding against the tile floor. I needed to get to the security room. I needed to find out what was happening, what I was seeing. As I reached the security office, I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it. I rushed to the monitors, desperately pressing buttons to pull up different camera feeds. But every screen showed the same thing: empty halls, dimly lit rooms, and that damn figure moving closer to me with every passing second. I slammed my hand against the console, trying to make it stop. This isn't real. It can't be. But the reflection on the screen was real. It had to be. The figure was still there, standing, waiting. And then, through the static, I heard it again. The whispering. Jake. It was soft at first, barely audible over the hum of the monitors, but it grew louder with each passing second until it was like a chorus, all speaking my name. I turned around. The room was empty. But as I looked back at the monitors, my reflection appeared on the screen. I didn't move. I didn't speak. But the reflection, it did. It moved independently of me, walking toward the door, just like it had done before. No, 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 no. The figure in the reflection paused. And then, with a sudden jerky motion, it turned its head to look directly at me. You're still here. I stumbled back, my back hitting the cold wall behind me. My breath came in quick, shallow gasps as the figure stepped closer, moving towards the door of the security room. The monitors flickered again, and the image of the figure disappeared from every screen except one. It was right outside. I didn't know what to do. I had to escape, but how could I leave if it was already in here with me? The door handle rattled. I froze. The rattling of the door handle was like a death knell in the silence of the security room. My heart pounded so loud, I thought it might explode from my chest. I held my breath, praying that somehow it would stop, that whatever it was outside would just go away. But it didn't. The handle rattled again, louder this time, followed by a low, dragging sound like something heavy scraping against the floor. The whispering grew louder too, a cacophony of voices, all overlapping, all calling my name. Jake. Jake. I pressed my back harder against the wall, trying to make myself as small as possible, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I was trapped. There was no other exit. I could hear the figure, or whatever it was, moving closer. The sound of its footsteps was slow, deliberate, almost mocking. Every step sent a chill through me, like fingers brushing across my skin. I didn't dare look away from the door. The seconds felt like hours as I waited, my body trembling with the fear that whatever was outside could sense my every movement, my every breath. The monitor beside me flickered, and I caught a glimpse of the figure again, standing just outside the security room. It was still smiling. That twisted, unnatural grin stretched wider, like it was savoring my fear. The figure's eyes, black and empty, stared straight into mine, sending a wave of nausea through my stomach. I knew it was coming for me. It wasn't just a reflection, it was real. It was in this building. And it wanted me. The door handle rattled again, this time with more force, as though the figure was trying to break through. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out. I had to escape before whatever was on the other side of that door got in. I stumbled to my feet, my legs unsteady, my thoughts scattered. I grabbed for the console, my fingers slipping across the cold buttons. I needed to lock everything down, to shut off the power, anything to stop the monitors, to stop the reflection from seeing me. The room was spinning. The walls felt like they were closing in, and I couldn't think straight. The sound of the door shaking filled the air, and I felt like I was drowning in it. Then, suddenly, the whispering stopped. Complete silence. For a moment, I thought I might have imagined it. That maybe I was just losing my mind. But then I heard it. A soft, metallic click. The door creaked open, slowly, as though it had all the time in the world. I froze. The figure wasn't in the hallway anymore. It was standing in the doorway. Its eyes locked with mine, and I could feel my entire body go rigid. The smile stretched even wider, so wide that its face seemed to contort with it. The shadows in the hallway behind it seemed to grow longer, darker, as though they were reaching for me, pulling me toward them. "Jake," it whispered again, but this time it wasn't just a voice. It was inside my head. I tried to back away, but my legs refused to move. My breath came in shallow gasps, my chest tightening with each passing second. The reflection, the thing on the other side, was too real. And the way it was looking at me, the way it knew me, was more terrifying than anything I had ever felt. It stepped forward, its feet dragging along the floor, the sound of its movement sending a chill down my spine. I could see the outlines of its hands, the fingers long and twisted, reaching toward me, slowly, inexorably. I had to get out. I had to move. But the room seemed to shrink around me. My vision blurred, and everything felt distorted, like I was being pulled into another world, a place where the lines between reality and nightmare didn't exist. The figure stepped closer, and I finally found my legs again. I spun around, rushing for the door behind me. The sound of the figure's footsteps followed, but this time they weren't slow. They were faster, almost running, matching my pace. I slammed into the door of the security room, desperately trying to escape, but it wouldn't open. The door was locked from the inside. I fumbled with the handle, my panic rising, but it wouldn't budge. I turned around, breathing heavily, trying to calm myself. But then I saw it. The reflection on the security monitor. It wasn't me anymore. It was the figure, standing behind me, smiling that grotesque smile. And this time, it wasn't just watching, it was moving, its hands reaching toward the screen, as if it was about to crawl out of the monitor and into the room with me. I screamed. I slammed my fists against the door, the metal rattling with each strike. The figure in the reflection was so close now, I could feel its breath on the back of my neck, its fingers brushing against the glass. My entire body shook with terror. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the door opened. It wasn't the sound of the lock turning, it was as if the door had opened by itself. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and I looked down the hallway. It was empty. No figure. No reflection. Just silence. I didn't know whether to run or stay. But something told me that whatever was happening wasn't over. That the reflection, the figure, it was still out there, watching, waiting. And I knew, deep down, that it would find me again. It always did. The hallway stretched out in front of me, dark and empty, but somehow it felt like it was closing in. My breath came in short, desperate gasps, and my legs felt like lead. I wasn't sure how long I'd been standing there, frozen with fear, staring into the darkness. The silence was deafening, but I could still feel that creeping presence, like the walls were closing in around me, and the air was thick with something unnatural. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't just stay here, but I didn't want to move either. I had no idea where the figure had gone. The reflection, the thing on the screen, it had disappeared as suddenly as it had come. But I knew it wasn't gone. I knew it was still here. The sound of my breathing was the only thing that filled the air. The stillness was almost unbearable. I glanced over my shoulder at the security room door, half expecting the figure to be standing right behind me, grinning that sickening smile. But there was nothing there. Just the emptiness, stretching on and on. I turned back to the hallway, my eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. The building felt different now. The usual sterile, quiet atmosphere of the office had turned oppressive, as though it was suffocating me. I felt watched. Not by cameras. Not by anyone on the other side of the monitors. But by something far worse. Something alive. I couldn't trust the monitors anymore. I couldn't trust anything. I took a hesitant step forward. Then another. My footsteps echoed through the empty hallway, each one amplifying the silence, each one pulling me further into the unknown. What was happening to me? The question circled in my mind, but I couldn't answer it. It didn't make sense. How could I trust anything now? How could I trust myself? I kept walking. There was nothing else I could do. I had to find a way out. A way to escape whatever was haunting this building. But it felt like the deeper I went, the more the place twisted around me. Every corner felt darker. Every door led to something new, something more wrong than the last. And then, I heard it again. A faint whisper, soft, almost imperceptible. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but the whisper grew louder. It was the same voice. The same whispering I heard in the security room, the same voice that had called my name. Jake. I froze, my blood running cold. It was closer now. The voice wasn't just in my head anymore. It was coming from down the hallway, faint but unmistakable. Jake. I turned toward the sound, but there was nothing there. No figure. No shadow. Just emptiness. I took another step forward, heart racing, my mind in turmoil. The whispers were all around me now, coming from every direction, a chorus of voices that seemed to stretch across time. They weren't just calling my name anymore. They were saying things I didn't understand. Words twisted, half-formed phrases that seemed to crawl beneath my skin, digging into my brain like worms. The air around me grew heavier, colder, and the sound of my breath sounded far too loud, too frantic. Jake, the voice whispered again, but this time it was different. It was distorted, warped, like the sound was bending, shifting, becoming something else. I turned toward the nearest door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. It was locked. I jerked on it, desperate to get away, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, like the building itself was alive and suffocating me. Jake. The voice was right behind me now. It was in my ear. I could feel the cold breath against my skin. I spun around, heart in my throat, but there was nothing there. Only the empty hallway. Only the flickering lights above me. The sound of my heartbeat filled my ears. It was so loud, so frantic, that I thought it might drown out everything else. But it didn't. The whispers didn't stop. They never stopped. And then, through the haze of fear, something caught my eye. A figure. Just at the edge of the hallway, standing in the shadows. I couldn't see it clearly, but I could feel its presence. It was watching me. Waiting. I didn't move. I couldn't move. I was frozen to the spot, my body refusing to obey, my mind screaming at me to run, to do anything, to get away. And then it stepped forward. The figure emerged from the darkness, its face obscured by shadow, but its form unmistakable. It was me. Or at least, it looked like me. But its eyes, those eyes weren't mine. They were black. Empty. Hollow. The smile on its face stretched wider, too wide, like it was tearing its own skin. It whispered my name again, but this time its voice wasn't soft. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a low, guttural growl. Jake. I didn't wait to hear the rest. I ran. I don't even know how my legs moved. They were stiff, shaking, but I ran. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The figure was right behind me, its footsteps echoing in my ears, getting louder, closer. I turned a corner, nearly stumbling as I tried to escape, but the hallway just stretched on endlessly. It felt like I was running in circles. Like I couldn't get away. Like the building had become a maze that had no end. The whispers were all around me now, louder, screaming until I couldn't hear anything else. My pulse pounded in my ears, my vision was starting to blur, and the shadows, those dark, creeping shapes, seemed to close in, blocking every path. I couldn't run anymore. I couldn't breathe. And then, as I reached for another door, I saw it. The figure was standing in front of me, waiting. It grinned again. And this time, I didn't scream. I just collapsed. I knew there was nowhere left to run. No escape. It had me. I don't know how long I was unconscious. My mind felt like it was trapped in some limbo, swirling between dark voids and moments of horrifying clarity. When I came to, I was lying on the cold, polished floor of the office hallway. My body was stiff, aching, but somehow, I was still alive. The air felt different now. Heavier. Almost thick. My heart hammered in my chest, but it wasn't fear. It was confusion, uncertainty. I couldn't remember how I'd gotten here or why I felt so wrong. I tried to move, but my limbs refused to cooperate. My head was swimming, and I was disoriented, unsure of where I was or what was happening. The only thing that felt real was the coldness of the floor beneath me, the flickering lights above me, and the silence that wrapped around me like a suffocating blanket. I slowly sat up, wincing at the sharp pain in my side. My hands shook as I pushed myself to my feet, my mind struggling to grasp what was going on. The office was eerily quiet. No more whispers. No more footsteps. Just the hollow sound of my own breath in the dark. Then I noticed it. The monitors. They were all on. Every single one of them. They weren't showing the usual blank screens like they should have been at this hour. No. The screens flickered with static, images shifting erratically, as though the very fabric of reality was warping before my eyes. But that wasn't what caught my attention. It was the reflection. There, on one of the monitors, I saw myself. But not the way I was now. The man on the screen was standing in front of the security room door, facing the same hallway. His face, my face, was twisted in a strange, unnatural grin. His eyes were wide open, but empty, like they were looking at something else, something I couldn't see. I froze. My pulse spiked in an instant, my stomach churning as the realization hit me. It wasn't just the voice on the screen. It wasn't just the figure I'd seen. It was me. But it wasn't. The figure in the monitor began to move. It walked down the hallway, step by deliberate step, following the exact same path I had taken moments ago. It reached the corner, stopped, then turned back toward the screen as though waiting for me to follow. But I couldn't. I couldn't bring myself to look away. The figure was me, but it wasn't. And I didn't know what to believe anymore. The room felt smaller, suffocating. The walls seemed to close in with every passing second. My own reflection, my other reflection, was still walking toward the far end of the hallway, as though it was alive, moving on its own, apart from me. The whispering returned. It was louder now, clearer. The voices, hundreds of them, all murmuring, overlapping, speaking in an unintelligible chorus. It was like the building itself was alive, breathing, feeding on the fear that had begun to seep into my veins. I grabbed onto the nearest chair, gripping it tightly, my knuckles white. My head felt like it was going to explode from the pressure. Every nerve in my body screamed to run, to get away, but where would I go? This place wasn't real anymore. It was a cage, and I was its prisoner. The figure on the screen stopped in front of a door. The same door I had passed earlier. The door that had once been locked. But now, I could see it clearly. It was open. It was calling to me. A soft, guttural voice broke through the cacophony of whispers. This time, it was my voice. "Jake, come closer." I didn't want to. I couldn't. But something inside me urged me forward. It was like I had no control over my own actions. The voice was too powerful, too familiar. It was my own voice, but wrong. I staggered toward the screen, toward the reflection of myself that wasn't really me. I reached out, but as soon as my hand touched the monitor, everything changed. The hallway around me began to distort. The walls seemed to bend, twisting into impossible angles. The lights flickered and then exploded into darkness. A sharp, high-pitched whine rang in my ears, followed by an unnatural silence that made my skin crawl. And then I was no longer standing in the hallway. I was somewhere else. The air was thick with dust, and the ground beneath me felt uneven, cracked. The familiar scent of the office building was replaced with the scent of rot, decay. The walls around me were covered in dark stains, and the once familiar hallway now felt like a different place entirely, a twisted version of the one I had been walking through. And there, at the end of the corridor, was the figure again. But this time, it wasn't just a reflection. It was real. It was standing there, staring at me with those empty, soulless eyes. And it smiled. A grin so wide it seemed to stretch beyond what was humanly possible. The air around me seemed to freeze as it took a step forward. I knew then. This wasn't the building I had been working in. It wasn't even my world anymore. The voice, my voice, whispered once more, but it wasn't comforting. It wasn't an invitation. It was a command. You belong here now. Have you ever woken up in the middle of the night and felt like someone was watching you? Like something in the shadows was waiting for you to notice? That's what happened to me. But it wasn't just a feeling. It was real. It was a quiet night, or at least it seemed like it at first. I had just finished a long day of work, and the bed felt like the only place I could escape. The clock on the wall ticked softly, the only sound in the room as I drifted into a restless sleep. I usually sleep like a rock, but that night, something was different. I woke up suddenly, my heart racing, as if something had yanked me from a deep sleep. My eyes scanned the room, but everything seemed normal. The moonlight filtered in through the curtains, casting soft shadows on the walls. The only thing out of place was a figure sitting at the edge of my bed. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. A bad dream, maybe. But no, this figure, this person, was real. They sat motionless, facing away from me, their outline faint but unmistakable. I couldn't see their face, but I could feel their presence. The air around me seemed to grow colder, heavier, as if the room itself was holding its breath. I wanted to scream, to move, but my body wouldn't respond. I was frozen, paralyzed with fear, my eyes locked on the figure as it just sat there. Its stillness was unsettling. It didn't speak, didn't move, didn't even acknowledge that I was awake. The room felt suffocating. I could hear the sound of my own breathing, shallow and quick, as my mind raced to make sense of what was happening. Who was this person? Why were they here? Minutes felt like hours as I stared at the figure, and just when I thought I might lose my sanity from the tension, I saw it. A movement so slight that I almost missed it. The figure's head turned, ever so slowly, toward me. I gasped, my throat dry, but no sound escaped. The figure's face remained hidden in the darkness, but I could feel its gaze, cold, intense, like it was looking right through me. I could feel its eyes, even if I couldn't see them. Then, without a word, without a sound, the figure stood up. The bed creaked under the weight, but there was no sound of footsteps. It didn't leave. It just stood there, watching me. I could feel the room closing in, the walls pressing against me, suffocating me. I wanted to run, to escape, but I couldn't move. My body was betraying me, refusing to respond. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the terrifying image in front of me, but when I opened them again, the figure was still there. It hadn't moved, not an inch. But the fear in the pit of my stomach kept growing, gnawing at me. Suddenly, I heard a soft, almost inaudible sound, a whisper, like a breath against my ear. I whipped my head around, expecting to see someone standing there, but no one was. The figure remained at the edge of my bed, silent, unmoving. And then, just like that, the moment stretched into eternity. I could feel the tension building, the room becoming more and more oppressive, until finally, as the first light of dawn began to creep through the window, the figure slowly stood up and vanished. Gone. As if it had never been there. I lay there, wide-eyed, drenched in sweat, my heart still pounding in my chest. I don't know if I fell back asleep or if I stayed awake until morning. But when the sun fully rose, the figure was gone, leaving behind nothing but a lingering sense of dread. I tried to tell myself it was a dream, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something had been in my room, something not of this world. Something that would come back. And every night since then, I've waited. Every night, I hear the soft creak of the floorboards, the faint rustle of movement near my bed. I know it's only a matter of time before the figure returns. And when it does, I won't be able to escape. The thing about the uninvited guest is that it always comes closer. It's been weeks now. Each night, I lie awake, waiting, watching, listening. The figure has yet to return, but the sense of something watching me has never left. It lingers in the corners of my mind, in the shadows of my room, where the light never quite reaches. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just a nightmare. A trick my mind had played on me after too much stress, too many late nights. But then, things started to happen. Small things. things I couldn't explain. I began hearing sounds during the night, soft and faint, like footsteps in the hallway outside my bedroom door. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, the creaks and groans of an old building. But as the days passed, the sounds became more distinct. They came closer. The slow, deliberate pacing, as if someone was walking around my room just out of sight. Sometimes, I would hear the faintest tap on the door, just one, almost imperceptible. I would jump out of bed, my heart racing, but when I opened the door, no one would be there. And then there were the whispers. At first, I dismissed them as nothing more than the wind or my mind playing tricks on me in the quiet of the night. But after hearing them more than once, I couldn't ignore it. The whispers weren't random. They were too distinct. Too deliberate. It was as if they were trying to get my attention. Calling my name. A soft, insistent voice that seemed to come from within the walls themselves. At night, when everything was still, I could almost hear it clearly, my name, spoken just behind my ear, too faint for anyone else to hear. I tried to ignore it, to tell myself it was just my imagination running wild. But the feeling of being watched never went away. The sensation of eyes on me, even while I was alone, was suffocating. It was like the house itself was alive, aware of me, studying me, waiting. One night, I finally couldn't take it anymore. I knew I had to do something. I wasn't going to let this continue, not with that feeling creeping in every night, that sense of someone or something lurking in the darkness, just beyond reach. So, I decided to face it head on. I waited until late at night, long after the house had settled into silence. The soft hum of the refrigerator downstairs, the occasional creak of the floorboards, the distant sound of traffic, all of it faded into nothing. The house felt empty, and that's when I heard it. A faint scraping noise, like something being dragged across the floor. It came from behind me, from the dark corner where the door met the wall. I stood up, heart pounding, and turned toward the sound. My feet felt heavy, as if they were unwilling to move, but I forced myself forward, my breath shallow in the quiet. The room felt colder. The air grew heavier. And then I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, a dark shape at the edge of my vision. But as I stepped closer, it became clearer. The figure. The same figure that had sat at the edge of my bed that first night. But now, it wasn't just sitting. It was standing, moving slowly, its face hidden in the shadows. Its presence was almost tangible, like the air itself was charged with its weight. I froze. My mind screamed at me to run, to leave the room, to escape before it could do anything. But my feet wouldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It was as if time had slowed down, and I was trapped in this moment, with the figure just a few feet away, looking at me. It didn't speak. It didn't move any closer, but it didn't need to. The fear, the terror I felt was enough. I could feel its eyes on me, cold and piercing, but I couldn't see its face. I could feel its presence like a pressure in the air. And then, in a moment of clarity, I understood. This wasn't just some random nightmare. This wasn't a trick of my mind. This figure, this thing, wasn't from my world. It was something else, something that had been drawn to me, to my presence. It had come once, and it would come again. It had marked me. And no matter how far I ran, how much I tried to ignore it, it would always find me. I took a deep breath, stepping back slowly, my eyes never leaving the figure. It didn't move. It didn't follow. It just watched. The longer I stared, the more it felt like the room itself was warping, bending around its presence, like reality itself was being twisted. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The room returned to its stillness, but the weight of it, the coldness, remained. The whispers were gone. The footsteps faded. But the figure was still there, in the back of my mind, lurking, waiting for the night to come again. I don't know what it is, or why it's here. But I know this, it's only a matter of time before it comes back. And next time, I might not be able to escape. Because the thing about the uninvited guest is, it always returns. It's been days since that night, and yet the feeling hasn't gone away. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside, every shadow that moves too swiftly catches my attention. I don't sleep anymore, not really. I lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening, waiting. I can't stop thinking about the figure, about the way it watched me with that empty gaze. The worst part? It's the silence. It's as if everything has quieted down since its visit. The whispers have stopped, the footsteps are gone, but in that eerie silence, the sense of something lurking, something waiting, is almost unbearable. I keep telling myself that it was just a hallucination, that maybe I was too tired, too stressed. But deep down, I know the truth. What happened wasn't a dream. I felt it. I saw it. And it's still here. I've tried everything. I've read about ghost stories, haunting tales, theories on parallel dimensions and spirits that linger in forgotten places. I've tried talking to people, but none of them understand. They tell me I'm imagining things, that it's just my mind playing tricks on me. But no matter how many times I tell myself that, I can't escape the feeling that it is still here, watching me from somewhere just beyond my reach. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. I haven't been able to sleep properly for days, and the exhaustion is starting to take its toll. Last night, I couldn't bear it any longer. I had to face it. If I didn't, I fear I would lose my mind. I armed myself with a flashlight, my hands shaking. I knew it was ridiculous. What was a flashlight going to do against something like that? But I needed something, anything, to feel in control. I crept down the hallway, every step feeling like it echoed through the house. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the distant ticking of a clock, the rustle of leaves outside, they all seemed so distant, like they belonged to another world. Only the silence of the house felt real, and it pressed in on me like a weight. I stood outside my bedroom door, holding the flashlight in front of me, the beam slicing through the dark. The door was slightly ajar, just as I'd left it. I pushed it open slowly, trying not to make a sound. My breath caught in my throat when I saw it. The figure was there again, sitting at the edge of my bed. But this time, it was different. It wasn't just sitting, it was moving. The figure was no longer still. It shifted ever so slightly, its head tilting in a way that shouldn't have been possible, as if it were studying me, waiting for me to react. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But my body refused to move. I could feel my heart racing in my chest, thundering in my ears, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. The figure didn't speak, but I could feel its presence. It was aware of me. Its silence felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. I took a step forward, and then another, my feet moving without my permission. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know why I was moving closer to it. Maybe I thought that by confronting it, I could make it go away. Or maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that it wasn't real. The flashlight trembled in my hand, the beam flickering as I approached. When I was just a few feet away, the figure turned its head slowly, so slowly that it seemed unnatural. It locked its gaze on me, and for a moment, I thought I would faint from the sheer terror of it. Its eyes, they weren't eyes at all. There were just two empty sockets, dark and endless, like the void. And then I heard it. The whisper. Soft, but unmistakable. "Why, did you wake me?" The voice was distorted, not quite human. It sounded like 1,000 whispers blending together, a sound that crawled into my bones and made my skin crawl. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence expanding, like it was consuming the space around it, filling every corner of the room with its weight. It was getting closer. I could feel it, even if it didn't move. Suddenly, the light flickered once more, and when it came back on, the figure was gone. The room was empty. I stood there, in the middle of the room, the flashlight still clutched in my hand, shaking. My breath came in ragged gasps. I scanned the room, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But there was nothing. No figure. No movement. Just the quiet hum of the house. I didn't know if it was a trick of the light or if I had imagined it all. But the feeling lingered, heavy and suffocating. I couldn't shake the thought that it had been here. And it would be back. I slowly backed out of the room, closing the door behind me with a trembling hand. I couldn't stay in there anymore. I needed to get out. I needed to leave. But the house seemed to close in around me. Every shadow, every creak, every whisper felt like it was waiting for me to turn around, to see it again. I've made up my mind. I can't stay here. I can't let whatever that thing is keep coming back night after night. I'm leaving. Tonight. But I can't shake one last thought that haunts me. What if I can't leave? What if it's already decided that I am the one who's going to stay? What if I'm already a part of this place? And what if it's too late to run? I didn't sleep that night. The thought of leaving, of escaping whatever this thing is, filled my every waking moment. But when morning came, I still hadn't moved a muscle, hadn't packed a single thing. There was something about the house that kept me rooted to the spot, as if it was refusing to let me go. Every step I took toward the door felt like I was walking through quicksand. My feet were heavy, like the house itself was pulling me back. I couldn't ignore the dread that settled in the pit of my stomach. The silence was suffocating, but it was the kind of silence that felt alive. It pressed against my ears, drowning out the sound of my own thoughts. I couldn't help but feel the weight of eyes on me, even though I knew no one else was there. When I finally gathered the courage to move, I walked through the house, trying to figure out what was happening. I went through every room, turning on every light, making sure there was no shadow, no movement, no sound that could explain the terrifying presence I felt. But no matter what I did, the house still felt wrong. It was as if every inch of it was steeped in the same thick, heavy air that had filled my room that night. I sat down at the kitchen table, my mind spinning in circles. Maybe I was going crazy. Maybe the lack of sleep was taking its toll, warping my perception of reality. But then I heard it. A soft tapping, almost like a knock on the door. I froze, my heart in my throat. My hands began to tremble as I turned toward the front door. There was no one there, I knew that. But the knocking came again, louder this time, more insistent. It was coming from the inside of the house. I could feel my pulse racing, panic rising in my chest. The house was responding to me, somehow, It wasn't just the house anymore. It was like it was alive, aware, watching me. I rushed to the door and threw it open, expecting to see someone on the other side. But there was nothing but the empty street, bathed in the cold light of the afternoon. No one around. No cars. No movement. Just the wind whispering through the trees. The knocking stopped as suddenly as it had started. I stepped outside, feeling a sense of relief flood over me, but it was short-lived. The feeling of being watched, of something following me, never left. It was as if the house itself had extended its reach, following me into the world outside. The cold air bit at my skin as I walked back into the house. My thoughts were a blur of fear and confusion. I tried to talk myself down, but the words felt hollow. How could I explain this? How could I make sense of it? I didn't want to go back in. I didn't want to face whatever had been in that room. But I knew I had to. I knew the house wasn't going to let me go. As I crossed the threshold back into the entryway, I felt it again. The presence. The oppressive weight that had followed me. But this time, I didn't feel alone. I heard a faint rustling behind me, followed by a soft, deliberate footstep. Then another. Then a breath, low and steady, close behind me. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing. Just the empty hallway. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow. A figure. It was standing in the doorway of the room where I had seen the thing last. Watching me. Silent. Patient. I took a step back, the blood draining from my face. It wasn't the same figure. This one was different, taller, more solid. The shape was clearer, sharper. But the eyes, those same dark, empty eyes, were still there. I could hear it now, its breath growing louder, closer. Leave, it whispered, but the voice was no longer distorted. It was clear. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet. The figure didn't move, but it was there, right there in front of me, its presence filling the hallway. It was the kind of fear that paralyzed you, the kind that made every move feel impossible. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. The figure raised a hand, slowly, deliberately, pointing at me. "You can't leave," it said, its voice calm and cold. The words sank into me, heavy and suffocating. I had to get out. I had to get away from whatever this thing was. But my feet wouldn't move, and I felt trapped. The air around me grew thicker, like the walls themselves were closing in. The figure took a step forward. "No one leaves," it whispered again. "Not once they're here." I felt a sudden chill, colder than anything I had ever felt. My breath caught in my throat. The figure's form blurred, shifting like smoke, and before I could react, it was gone. I stood there, frozen in place, my heart racing. The room was silent again, but the feeling lingered. The thing, whatever it was still here. Watching. Waiting. And I was no longer sure if I was ever going to be able to leave. The night came quickly, though it felt different, darker, heavier, as if the very air was thick with something unspoken. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, but it wasn't just the fear of the unknown anymore. It was the certainty that something was in the house with me, something that I couldn't escape, no matter where I went. I couldn't sleep. I hadn't slept in days, not since the first night when it all started. The bed, once a place of comfort, now felt like a prison. Every creak of the house, every whisper of wind outside, set my nerves on edge. I couldn't even bring myself to look at the shadows in the corners of the room because I knew that they were moving, changing. They were watching me, waiting. I forced myself to leave the room, hoping that the house might feel different if I moved around. But the second my feet touched the cold wooden floors, I felt it again, the weight of eyes upon me. My body tensed as I stepped into the hallway. The house was eerily quiet, but the silence was loud in its own way. I could hear the faintest whisper of breathing, slow and steady, coming from the shadows. I wasn't alone. I walked cautiously toward the living room, my steps light, my breath shallow. The floorboards groaned beneath my feet, but the whispers, those soft, hushed tones, were growing louder. I knew it wasn't the wind. I knew it wasn't my mind playing tricks. Whatever was in this house was alive, in some twisted way, and it was getting closer. As I reached the doorway of the living room, I stopped. The silence had returned, but it was different. It was too still, like the calm before a storm. And then I saw it. A figure, just like before, but this time it was closer. It was standing in the middle of the room, its back to me. Its shape was tall, almost too tall, its limbs too long, like it was stretching to reach the ceiling. The thing was so still, so unnatural in its stillness, that I couldn't breathe. Its head tilted slightly to one side, as if listening. Waiting. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to break the tension, but my body wouldn't obey. I was frozen, trapped by the sheer presence of it. It turned slowly, deliberately, its movements sharp and jerky, like a puppet on strings. Its face was a blur of shadows, but the eyes, those deep, hollow eyes, stared directly into mine. They didn't blink. They didn't move. They were endless, black voids, sucking the life from me. "You're not supposed to be here," it whispered. The voice was chilling, low and almost musical, like a song sung just out of reach. "You shouldn't have come." I felt a chill crawl up my spine, the air growing heavier with every word. I didn't know what it wanted, what it was, but I knew one thing for certain: if I didn't get out now, it was going to make sure I never left. The figure took a step toward me, its long arms swinging like broken branches in the wind. I tried to back away, but my legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed, caught in the stare of those black eyes. It was as if the house itself had frozen me in place, holding me hostage. "You can't leave," it said again, its voice almost soft now, coaxing. "You belong here, just like all the others." I didn't understand. What did it mean? All the others? The thing took another step, and I finally found my voice. "Who are you?" I gasped, barely able to get the words out. "What do you want from me?" The figure didn't answer. It only stepped closer, its breath cold against my skin. I could feel it now, the presence that had been hovering in the room, getting closer with each second. It opened its mouth, but instead of speaking, a guttural, inhuman sound poured out, something between a growl and a hiss, a sound so unsettling that it made my stomach churn. It was the sound of something ancient, something otherworldly. I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but my feet refused to cooperate. I knew I had to get out, but how? Where was the door? Where was my escape? The figure reached out, its fingers like claws, and I thought for a moment that I could feel its touch on my skin. Cold, sharp, like ice burning into my flesh. I flinched, but I couldn't move. I was trapped, held in place by the thing's presence, by the house that had claimed me. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The figure vanished, melted into the shadows, leaving only the faintest echo of its breath behind. I was left standing in the middle of the room, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. The house was silent again. But this time, it wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of something waiting. Waiting for me to break, to give in. Waiting for me to accept that I would never leave. That I was already a part of it. I turned toward the door, my hands trembling as I reached for the handle. I had to leave. I couldn't stay here anymore. But when I opened the door, I was met with the same empty street. It was all the same. The house, the streets outside, nothing had changed. I stepped outside, but something told me I would never escape. No matter how far I went, I would always be tethered to the house, to the figure that had claimed me. And as the door slammed shut behind me, I heard its voice one last time. "You can never leave," it whispered. And I knew, deep down, that it was true. Thank you for making our stories part of your relaxation time. We hope they brought you a sense of peace and transported you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.